Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber.
Reported by Hansard, and we don't want to interfere with. Posterity would not forgive us all that well.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed.
Ask members to declare obligation to declare any relevant financial.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber. Programme signed.
Business.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber.
Apologies at this stage. An apology from Danny Kinahan. I suspect, given the lateness of the night, there'll probably be a few.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber.
But does anybody have any other apologies for non-attendance? Okay. If not, I'll leave. I think as at least as both the items have albeit fairly uncontroversial, additional activities arising out of them and decisions. I'll leave Chair's business, the draft minutes, for the moment, and also the matters arising. So we'll have to skip over those for a moment until we get a fifth member. We'll go back to those later on. Okay, if we can maybe get the department in on the June monitoring. I remind members that there is the clerk's cover note on this in your papers is at page 17, and also then there's a paper provided by the department, which is also as part of that. Also, remind members that there are table papers which include an update on the uptake of teaching and non-teaching redundancies, and an update of information from the Education Authority on the delayed payment of pay rises. So I would like to welcome the following officials. We have Trevor Connolly, who's Director of Finance, Philip Irwin, who is the Director of Investment and Infrastructure, Gavin Patrick, who's the Deputy Finance Director, and Laverne Montgomery, who's the Director of Workforce Development. And we'll invite the officials who want to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. We're grateful for the opportunity to discuss DA's proposals for the 2015-16 June monitoring round. As you know, this is the first monitoring round this year. Committee will be aware in your monitoring rounds provide an opportunity to review departmental spending plans priorities in light of more up-to-date information. For this round, departments have been asked to provide details of reduced requirements and bids. Details of our proposals to be submitted for consideration by the Executive have already been provided to the members. In summary, there is no resource or capital reduced requirements being declared. The Department is making 4 resource bids, all of which are deemed to be inescapable in the following priority order: school surplus $5 million, early years $2 million, furniture and equipment for capital projects $3.6, and school maintenance $18.4. The Department is also making 6 capital bids, 2 of which we deem inescapable: minor works $12.1 million and school transport $2.4, and then 4 of which we consider to be high priority: the school enhancement programme $15 million, youth $3 million, other capital $1.8, and minor works $38 million. You've clearly been provided with the details of the proposal, so rather than reiterate that, happy to take any questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. You're very suitably succinct today, which I think we appreciate, given the night this before us. Open up to others in a minute or two. I just want to ask you a couple of opening questions. Can I ask you, obviously, in terms of the position, and I suppose this it's a little bit sort of, I wouldn't say tangential, but at least it relates it in terms of the issue of the impact on finances on the redundancies situation side of it. Now, at the moment, the information we've got, which suggests, I think, the latest figures, unless there's anything you wish to update us with, in terms of teachers' redundancy of 211 and the non-teacher redundancy of 209. And in terms of your overall financial position, because we also need to look in monitoring right, not simply at where fresh allocations is being sought, but I suppose emerging pressures on that side of it. I suppose first thing, just in relation to that, because those are a long distance short of the target. I suppose in terms of the how accurate and up to date those figures are. I mean, are there any further applications within the process, or is that an indication of of what you see sort of almost as the final tallies for this year in terms
Okay, Chair, if I could ask Laverne on the work.
Okay.
Certainly, yes, Chair. You received correspondence, I believe, yesterday morning in relation to this. So 211 teaching redundancy applications are currently with the Department for consideration, and 209 non-teaching. Now, they are all school-based redundancies. We also have a voluntary severance scheme which has been launched by the Education Authority, and it is due to close today in relation to expressions of interest. And the latest number that I have from those expressions of interest are 250 expressions of interest. So that will be updated today with the latest figures. So we can certainly share that with you once we've got that.
Okay, Laverne, but in terms of the if we're talking 250 there, but the 211, the 209, and those other elements of it, are those on the basis that those are all that's within the system total?
Certainly, with regards to the school-based, okay. Yes, they're all that are in the system.
Well, I mean, just I suppose one of the areas of concern from a financial point of view, the target figures on those had been 500 for the teacher redundancy side of it and 1,000 on the non-teacher. In terms of the impact on the budget, because you looked at a certain level of school savings, are those still realisable with what appeared to be only a proportion of what was being sought?
What I would say, Chair, in the first instance is to call them a target would be inaccurate in the sense that they were never a target. They were figures that were, and certainly the background to the figure work, Trevor and Gavin can provide detail, but they were figures that were based on the fact that 77% of the education budget is based on salaries. And so it was an extrapolation of what that could mean in relation to the impact on the budget. So that's where the figure of 500 and 1,000. But the issue is that, and as you know, we have local management of schools, so it will always be for the individual boards of governors to examine their own budgets and make decisions in that regard.
On that basis, Laverne, then what impact do you see in terms of the school budget? I mean, I appreciate and I suppose different departments sometimes could be a target, sometimes it could be an extrapolation. On that side of things, I don't know whether the thesaurus has been well thumbed today in that regard, but from that point of view, what assumption was made on those figures, be it by way of extrapolation, on the overall budget and the school budget, and what the fact that the extrapolation has not been met, put it that way, what impact does that have on your budget, particularly as regards to the school's budget?
I think, Chair, if I bring you back to our actual public savings delivery plan, we did recognise the potential. Because clearly, as Laverne's already said, we said that in our initial assessment of how the 98 million funding gap was going to be achieved, at that stage a large part of it was staff costs, and it was really a ratio of 2 to 1. Now, one of the things we clearly was that to achieve that level of staff reductions, the number of staff who would have to go would neither be achievable nor desirable. So one of the pieces of work we did was actually go back and re-examine the budget and identify additional savings to come out of the non-staff. And the workings of that meant that our actual savings delivery plan is 114.5. We still, at this point, say that our funding gap is only 97.8. 97.6. So we have headroom, and the reason why we've had that headroom is to build a buffer so that if the savings don't be achieved that we had anticipated, that we have money there to offset. So that money has not yet been allocated by the Minister. The question in terms of schools is, as Laverne said, we have went out to schools, we have given them on the 25th of February their CFS allocation for 15-16. They've been clearly told, and they're fully aware of the difficulties and challenges in 15-16, and they've also been made very clear that it is their responsibility in terms of the Board of Governors to balance their budget. Now, one of the key issues then is this is a key opportunity. If you look at our ASB, 91% of the 1.1 billion that goes to ASB is actually staff cost. So if you're going to balance your books, and I know there's Board of Governors around the table, staff is the key criteria. I think the key issue for us is that all schools have been given the opportunity in terms of both teaching and non-teaching redundancies to balance their books. But to me, the authority now will have a key role for all of the controlled and maintained schools to make sure that school deficits are very tightly managed, because from our perspective, having given that opportunity, if schools have said, no, we don't need to make redundancies, then commensurate with that is that they feel that they can manage their budget and achieve a balanced budget without having to do that. Because what we can't allow is people to say, I'm not going to make the redundancies, but I'm going to overspend. Because what that means then is that becomes a pressure on the block grant for the authority. And that's a big
understand
pressure.
that effectively it's getting thrown in one level, either through redundancies or another way to the school's budget side of things in that regard. I mean, I think there is at least an appreciate the extent to which this is, you know, I suppose an extrapolation, and also from that point of view that you know, the figures haven't been achieved. I suppose there's maybe a bit of concern that if, I suppose maybe a little bit of question in my mind, but I appreciate it's not really one for today, as to why it seems to be in other sectors that there seemed to have been quite a large level of interest, and the level within the broader educational format seems to be less than if you compare it with other aspects of things on it.
I suppose the only comment I'd make, Chair, is that I joined the department in 2011, and we have had a redundancy programme for every single year, because as part of making the 2011-15 savings delivery plan, we had to make significant savings in the first year. So I suppose to a certain extent, and I know in terms of people around here would turn around and say that in their experience of schools already have made very difficult decisions to achieve the balance. The difficulty we have is the 15-16 budget is even more challenging, and that's why there's even more difficult decisions that the Minister's had to make to balance his books, but also schools have to go and look again in terms of can they live within their allocation. Now, their allocation for 2015-16 is about 2.2 million in cash terms higher than 14-15, but clearly, effectively what that means is that they have to absorb their pay and price pressures in 15-16. So that is a genuine pressure on all schools.
Oh, Chair, and just on that very point, since 11-12, the department has affected something in the region of 1,400 teacher redundancies.
Okay.
So that hasn't been the case across other public sector.
So it's an issue of staging in that regard.
Yes.
Okay, I want to turn just to two other issues then before I open it up to others. Directly speaking in terms of the June monitoring, you've obviously outlined particularly on a range of the issues where the bids are coming in. Now, I think members can obviously speak for themselves. I mean, I think all of those are very worthy subjects to be seeking. Indeed, seem to be quite sensible subjects. However, I suppose, maybe explain, why they were particularly prioritised, while there would be at least three elements that the committee had written to you on in terms of concerns on the issue of the Sentence STEM school projects, on the issue of the primary modern language programme and the Book Trust Book Start, and maybe just explain sort of why they aren't in the monitoring round.
Okay, Chair. I think if I start off just in terms of the first part of your question, which is the Minister's prioritisation. Well, number one, school surpluses. The process that was agreed way back in 2011 by the Executive, this is the process. We bid for any potential drawdown in June, and that's then refined in January, and that's part of the process. In terms of early years, and obviously as part of the correspondence from the committee, you yourselves have identified, the impact in terms of the early years fund, and I think the Minister's on record that while he has, from the outset, always wanted to protect frontline services, to achieve the 97.6 million savings, he's had to make some very difficult decisions, and those decisions have impacted upon projects that in any other circumstances he would want to fund. And I think when he was here on the 4th of March, he made that comment sort of publicly, that because of the decisions and the financial situation we're in, he has had to stop things that in any other circumstance he would want to continue. And I think certainly, to my mind, all three, the modern primary school languages, the sentence, which is reduced by the 100,000, and the Book Start, would all be things that we would want to keep. But his clear focus has been on protecting frontline. To put that in context, the ASB is 60% of our overall budget. We have kept that in cash terms protected. Now, if you're achieving a 5% reduction in your overall budget and you're then turning around and saying 60% of it is protected, clearly, proportionately, you have to make more cuts elsewhere. And I think that has been the decision, because that side of the ASB is such a large proportion of our budget. It has meant the Minister has had to make proportionally bigger cuts elsewhere. In terms of the furniture and equipment, I'll give a very brief overview and then Philip, but I think, and the committee have already identified, we have issues there in terms of we reduced that budget by 7 million. There's capital projects ongoing, and we have identified in terms of two things. One, that the Minister has made an allocation of 1.8 million. That's come out of our existing contingency fund because of the timing issue, to actually make sure that those projects go ahead now. And then we're bidding for the 3.6 million as part of June monitoring. Philip, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I suppose the reason that that's being prioritised relates to the scale of the original allocation, which was significantly below where we needed to be. And we, the Minister had asked that we took a very close look at the degree to which, when we were commissioning new accommodation, we would be able to reuse existing furniture and equipment. In some cases, you'll be able to do that. If it's a like-for-like replacement of, say, a temporary or a building, you may well be able to reuse equipment. If it's a new piece of accommodation that's being added, a lab, sports equipment or a sports facility, where there is no existing equipment, then we obviously have to find the money to be able to use the asset. So as Trevor has said, we've been able to find an additional allocation of 1.8 million, but that still leaves us 3.6 million below the total requirement, if you like, for furniture and equipment for the capital works that we're undertaking in year. Now, we will still look to see what we can do in terms of reuse to try and fill that gap, potentially allocate less to each individual project. But in an ideal world, we would obviously like to fit those buildings.
Sorry that that's covered partly sort of the final question, but just in terms of the achievement of spend on the Schools Enhancement Programme, are you confident that, given the fact that I think it was only 8 million was directly achieved in 2014-15, that you'll be able to achieve all the spend on the Schools Enhancement Programme as we move ahead?
Absolutely. I mean, the spend in last year, it was to do with the timing of the programme. The schemes were all going on site towards the end of the last financial year. We currently have 13 schemes designed and ready to go to procurement, but we don't have sufficient capital to put those on site. You'll see in the capital bids as well, the School Enhancement Programme, we've bid for effectively the money to be able to put all of those schemes on site in this financial year, if the capital was available. So
I think that's the context, Chair. Last year our capital budget was 180 million. Whenever Philip and the Minister were looking in terms of the planning, we were envisioning that would hopefully be then maintained this year. So one of the issues was to actually have that sort of pipeline of projects that would actually go through. Our capital budget was reduced by 20%. And clearly then that's had a knock-on effect in terms of what's there. But I think, you know, in terms of from Philip's perspective, he'll come on to it when we come on to the capital, there are 13 projects that are ready to go. We simply just don't have the funding.
Okay, I mean, obviously it's important that not just simply you've got the pipeline, but that things flow through it at a fast enough rate. I suppose that's... No
question. I mean, we could spend more than that in the School Enhancement Programme, and in fact more than the bid if we had the money. And I'd be absolutely confident of that.
Okay, well, not confident note. I'll open up. Sean, I think you're next.
Yeah, as I say, you're very welcome. Could I just go back to what you said, the point you made, Laverne, there, and there's a lot of reference made to 2011, and you started in 2011. So you say over that period of time there's been 1,400 teacher or school redundancies?
Teaching redundancies.
Teaching redundancies. But over the same period of time, the department has spent an additional 10% on salaries and so on. What is the department doing to, in terms of redundancies, etc., and offering redundancies and so on, to reduce the administration costs?
within the Department of Education itself.
Yeah.
It's not my area, Chair, but certainly I am aware that the voluntary exit scheme right across the NICS, the Department of Education is very much a part of that. And indeed yesterday, staff would have received letters indicating if they were selected to go in what is being called the first tranche of redundancies, which would be at the end of September this year. Now, that is subject to funding. So they are conditional letters, conditional offers that have been given to staff within the Department of Education and across the NICS.
Chair, if I can come in, I think that there's two contexts, Sean, in terms of our savings delivery plan from 2011 to March 2015. There was 15 million that was a reduction in administration costs. That primarily came out of the boards in 2011-12, and each year there was an ongoing reduction in terms of departmental administration. In 15-16, the departmental administration cost will reduce by 3 million, which is 9%, which is significantly nearly double the 5% overall. The 97.6 million relates to 5% of our opening budget. So yes, from our perspective, there are reductions in costs within the department. Clearly, also in terms of the allocation that's went to the authority in terms of the block grant, we have already identified in the SDP that there's pay and price pressures that they too will have to absorb. So yes, there has been, and I think it's important to take the contextual point. For the 4 years up to March 2015, we have been ongoing reducing administration throughout all of the NDPBs and the department. And in 15-16, there is a 9% reduction in our departmental staff costs, and also clearly for the authority, it has to balance its books, but effectively by giving it a small year-on-year cash uplift like the ASB, it will have to absorb pay and price pressures, which we estimate roughly about 10 million in 15-16.
And Trevor, how would the staff complement have changed from 2011 to 2014 within the department?
Sorry, Chair, I don't know. I don't have a
John,
figure.
sorry, Trevor, just on that, I appreciate there may be some items of detail that we're pressing on, but what I would suggest, because there's that, I think the other issue in relation to that, which I don't know if you have the figures in front of you, when we're talking about the voluntary exit scheme, and I appreciate it's dependent upon resources being made available, it's a wider context issue, I don't know if you have the figures, or I suppose if you can get back to us with the figures that Sean asked in terms of the staff complement side of it, but
yes.
Also, I suppose, if you can provide us written reply, if you don't have it to hand, of, in terms of the voluntary exit, what are within the department the number of expressions of interest, and has there been any decision taken on the numbers that are likely to be released? And if you could, I don't know if you have those to hand. If you don't, it would be useful to get those to us as well.
Yeah.
And the next one really is in terms of, yes, the June monitoring round. When would you hope, if things worked out, for example, that there was some money available for early years, when would you hope to be communicating that to early years people?
Well, in normal circumstances, Chair, the executive would meet at probably the 24th, 5th, whatever that Thursday is for the executive meeting. That would be the normal timescale, and then as soon as those decisions are made, clearly then, you know, the Minister and the policy would be looking in terms of they would have the funding, but in the current environment, I'm not sure what's going to happen in terms of timing. But normally, I suppose we would be looking at the allocation of funding would come to us by the end of June, start of July, in normal circumstances.
And Trevor, from that point of view, and I appreciate, I don't know if there's a differentiation between what happens for the rest of this year and what happens beyond that. Whenever there are questions in the House at education question time, I think the Minister seemed quite responsive to the idea that the funding in terms of early years should be in the context of quite an open call, and whether that was by way of a fresh process, or that it wouldn't simply be a question of taking groups that had been previously funded and simply rolling that over, because that seemed to set sort of potential barriers to new groups, new areas seeking that. Do you know, in terms of any additional funding that's coming in, will that be on the basis of it being effectively open call? Again, I appreciate it may be slightly unfair
Sorry, Chair, I don't know the I am aware that certainly in one of his AQs it said about that the original fund, which was something like 2004, was that sort of closed fund. Yeah. I'm not close enough to the detail to know, but by all means, if Peter writes, we can come back on that.
I think from that point, it may be useful to follow that up, because I think it was an issue I know the Minister had touched on in questions in the House during the week on it, and I suppose particularly if, and we don't know whether the bid will be successful, but particularly if there's additional money coming in, or maybe returning to early years, I think on the basis on which that's coming in, I think would be important as well.
Okay. In the present financial circumstances, it's just difficult to comprehend how schools are still allowed to overspend. How many schools, say within this last financial year, were given permission to overspend, and for what sort of reasons?
Well, no school can overspend without the authority of, up until March 2015, its respective Education Library Board as funding authority, and clearly in 15-16 the authority. The authority's role is to manage both deficits and surpluses. Because clearly our guidance is that it should be the lesser of 75,000 or 5% of your allocation. And I suppose that has been there for a long time, but it's a realistic estimate that, schools are not, if you like, dedicated profit centres, and a small primary school in terms of administration. So there's a balance there as regards to practical. But once people say that they're going to overspend, that plan has to be approved by the authority. And if that plan isn't approved, then the authority has to go back to the Board of Governors and challenge the Board of Governors to come back and say, look, what are you doing about this, and how are you going to produce a balanced budget? Because I think, certainly from my perspective, one of the key issues we have is in terms of the information that goes to schools, is that the Board of Governors' responsibility is to prepare a balanced budget. They do not have the authority to overspend on that budget. And the responsibility rests with the Education Authority to manage that tightly, because, as I said to the Chair earlier, if schools have had the opportunity to look at their cost base in terms of teaching and non-teaching and propose redundancies, if they haven't done that, then to me the clear assumption is that they feel that they can balance their books without having to do that. What they can't do is simply turn around and say that that means that we're just going to overspend. Because if that happens, then all schools overspend, and we have the authority has a very challenging position, because in essence what does that mean? It means that you have a budget of 100,000 but you spend 120. Well, that 20,000 has to be found elsewhere within the block grant, and effectively you're now taking resources off other schools. Yeah, and that's the challenge for the authority.
Jonathan had something on that specific point you just wanted to raise?
Yeah, Trevor, it's on that specific issue, because I think we're all aware, and my colleagues no different to me, of schools who have been in the red, and they've been in the red for decades, and both the governors and the management within the school has done absolutely nothing to try and reduce those deficits within those schools. The boards deliberately took no action on that, because they had powers and remits. They could have removed the governors and replaced them, but they refused to do it. Are you giving out a very strong message then to the new Education Authority that if this continues, they will have to remove the governors and actually deal with this issue, as opposed to just sitting there and completely ignoring it? Well, and what I was told, Trevor, was that they allowed other schools to have massive surpluses to make up for those who deliberately buried themselves in debt.
Well, I suppose, Chair, that there's two elements to that. I'm not instructing the authority in terms of what options it says. What I am clearly saying is that the authority has a responsibility to manage those deficits. One of the clear options it has is to withdraw delegation. Now, from my perspective, that is the role of the authority, is to manage that. What options they put and the decisions they make, I'm not given any sort of clearance, because the one clear thing is it all depends on the individual circumstances of the school. Some schools are financially not viable, and that's a systemic issue. That's where the area-based planning comes into. Other schools, you could argue that it is poor financial management on behalf of that school, or that Board of Governors are not prepared to make the financial decisions. But that comes through on their financial plan. And if their financial plan shows that, for instance, they have recurring deficits, but that they are not making any proposals to reduce their staff cost, which is over 90% on average of their budget, then to me the authority has to sit down with the Chair and the Board of Governors and say, how are you going to balance your budget? Because if we don't have that as a basic principle, then the whole local management and delegation of responsibility to the Board of Governors becomes a clear question. Because if each school doesn't do that, we have a very difficult position for the authority to balance its books.
And what pressure is the department going to try and put on the new Education Authority to actually carry out that remit? Because the board singly failed on that issue. Well,
certainly, Chair, like in terms of the 4 years that I've been in post, we've had quarterly meetings with each one of the boards, and in each one of those meetings, we have went through schools with large surpluses and deficits. We've referred that back to educational outcomes, because it's the same situation with schools with large surpluses and poor educational outcomes. That money is voted for the education, and certainly I've been looking at and challenging the boards in terms of both perspectives, but I think it's important always to bring it back to the individual circumstances of each school, because it's too easy to be totally generic. You have to look at what the circumstances of that school are. Is it financially viable, or is it poor financial management?
Does it sound, Trevor, of the sort of Henry II of who will remove this turbulent priest in that regard? That seems a bit of a hint is being given to the education. Now, I should declare, I should have probably at the start, in terms of declaration of interest, indicated I'm on the Board of Governors of 3 schools, none of which are in deficit, so I'll not be getting any visitations from either the department or the education authorities. Hopefully, in that regard.
I suppose, Chair, like, you know, in terms of the actual allocation letter, in terms of the stuff, like we have made it clear to, you know, there is no ambiguity that the responsibility to manage schools' budgets for the controlled, maintained schools rests with the authority. You know, Mr. Craig has made it clear that, in his view, that has not been, you know, at an optimum level. If schools' budgets are not managed, especially in the current very challenging circumstances, what will happen is there's an overspend on the schools line, and that has to be balanced by a further reduction on the block grant. And so what impact does that have? That means that services such as special education, transport, catering, those type of things then are impacted. So to me, it's incumbent on each individual Board of Governors to balance their budget.
There's a clear implication for people in that regard.
Absolutely.
Okay. Pat's been very patient with me.
Thanks very much. And just on that...
Oh, sorry, Sean, Sean perhaps hadn't finished.
I'm sorry, I had another one, and that was, Philip, in regard to the school enhancement project and the decision to, in terms of the furniture and equipment and so on, to fund 5 out of the 22, their furniture and equipment, and to cut the others to 0. Could you give me the logic sort of behind that in terms of really sound financial planning and so on? You know, I'll give you two examples. One being St Joseph's Primary School in Carnacappel, where they're moving into a new building. Okay, they're probably moving out of a mobile and they're taking the desk and that you could manage with that sort of stuff with you. But a Key Stage 1 group, for example, there'd be a lot of play equipment and so on, so they would need more money. And then on the other hand, not even, we're moving into a new facility, an extra facility in Dundrum. They will have a beautiful building at Christmas, but unless something happens, they'll have nothing to put in it because it's an extra facility. Why, in circumstances like that, was it not decided that a certain percentage of furniture and equipment budget was given to those schools, rather than funding 5 completely and leaving the other 17 adrift?
Well, I suppose there's a process here, but to be clear, first of all, there's an additional allocation of 1.8 million has been made to the furniture and equipment budget. So all of those SEP projects will now have sufficient budget to meet their requirements. The process really began back at the point when the budget was being considered, and I think the Minister's view was he wanted to defend the frontline services and staff, in particular teachers and so on, as his primary goal. So a significantly reduced allocation was made to furniture and equipment, and we, the team, were asked to go and look at what options we had in terms of reuse of existing equipment. I suppose if we'd done it the other way around, simply allocated the money and sought to remove the frontline services, once they're gone, they're gone. So the decision was taken to allocate a minimum resource, to look at what other options we might have, and to deal with pressures in year as we progress.
I think, Chair, this is back to my earlier point. If you have 60% of your budget is the aggregate schools budget, which effectively is pure front line, all the schools, as you well know, Sean, protecting that was the Minister's, key focus. Now, once you have nearly 2/3 of your budget protected, and you still have 5% of reductions to make elsewhere, you are faced with very difficult decisions. And clearly one of the difficult decisions was, as I alluded to earlier, when we were looking at the savings delivery plan, we went back and did a complete review of every line in the budget, identifying what were staff costs and what were non-staff costs. Because we had the issue, which is, would we actually achieve the number of staff costs, especially in terms of the voluntary scheme, to be able to balance their books? So the context of this has been a prime example of where, in any other circumstances, the Minister would not have reduced the furniture and equipment budget. Like in our draft budget, we actually had this in as an inescapable pressure, because we appreciated that the Minister had signed off on these projects and this was the cost. But if you want to protect frontline teaching and non-teaching staff in schools, then, and at 60% of your budget, you have to make very difficult decisions on the rest of the budget.
See, I understand that, Trevor, but my point really is, if, for example, let's take a nominal fee, a nominal amount of money of, say, 100,000 that the school was getting for the furniture and equipment, whatever else. And yes, we understand money is tight and so on. But what the schools are really saying is, if we knew that we had to really prioritise, and we were only getting 25,000, 30,000 now, at least we could move on with actually the planning and so on to see could we get through.
But I think we need to be clear that there are distinctly different types of projects here, where if you are moving an existing classroom or replacing an existing classroom, then reusing equipment is a real option. If you're adding an additional facility, a lab, a sports hall, in some cases additional facilities in a special school under SEP, where there is no existing equipment, then we have to allocate the money to that. So it's not a case of we could simply say everyone gets 40% of their budget. We had to be a little bit more discriminatory and to say where it is possible for people to reuse and to reuse 90% of their equipment, well, then they should do that. The ones that have not got equipment to reuse, we will have to allocate the money to them. So a sort of broad brush, we'll just give everyone X% was not the way to.
I don't want to labour the point, Chair, but not even, for example, we're cut from 340,000 to zero.
Sorry, what was the three?
In terms of furniture and equipment and so on, they got at that stage. Okay, it's been rectified now, but if you take through the logic of your argument, they shouldn't have been cut to zero for furniture and equipment at that stage. Okay, things hopefully are better now.
Okay, I suppose it's a bit difficult to get into individual cases. Pat, you've been more patient than I thought you were in that regard.
I noted mentioned that he's done there in 3 schools, none of which is in deficit, but he didn't mention whether or not they're running a surplus. Now, I think that
they're all sort of the very good boys and girls of the departments in the department's good book.
But in a sense,
I'm not going to get any sort of sanctioned letter from the department or the authority on either side.
In a sense, it shows a mindset that if the school is in deficit, it has to be mentioned. But if they're running a surplus, it doesn't seem to be as bad. But we see how difficult times are at the minute. And a lot of schools that are running surpluses are saying they're saving it for a rainy day. And I've heard the Minister say himself, the rainy day is here.
Absolutely.
If there's surplus there, if it's over 75 grand or over 5% of the budget, then it needs to be spent, and especially in schools where there are poor educational outcomes.
Absolutely.
And I hope the new authority, under pressure from the department, will take a new look at schools that are running surpluses. Because if we look even at issues such as the early years, I'm sure there's more than enough money slushing around these schools that are running surpluses that would cover early years funding. I've no doubt about that. But come back to early years. The Minister has said that if he does get that funding in the June monitoring round, it'll be a different scheme. What way will that operate?
Sorry, Chair, I don't know the details sufficiently, Pat, to be able to answer the question, but happy to go back to policy.
I think yes, to take that on board. That
certainly, whatever comments obviously the Minister has made in terms of AQs, I would fully agree. I am aware that one of the issues in terms of the original scheme was that it related back to roughly about 2004 and it was closed to other applicants. So, but I'm not close enough to the detail to be able to answer.
I think, Pat, it would be very useful. I mean, and obviously I've mentioned this as well. I mean, I think if there isn't the answers now, I think it is important we actually get the detail from the department.
By all means.
In terms of that, I think, because it will be important to groups out there. In terms
absolutely. Just one final question, Chair, on the Modern Languages programme, that it has been stopped altogether. And to be quite honest, I'm not particularly opposed to that. I'm not sure there was any great educational advantage to the programme, although I think the idea behind it is good. But we've seen a decline in numbers of students who are taking modern languages at GCSE and A-level. So it certainly hasn't helped in incentivising young people to take up modern languages. And I'm just wondering, are you aware of any arguments that have been produced to support the reinstatement of the Modern Languages programme that are based on educational outcomes in terms of improved linguistic skills? On
a personal basis, Chair, no. But to be fair, it's not one that necessarily would come to me directly. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to kick the touch again and say, look, if you know, Peter wants to write to us, you know, and we get the relevant policy side to answer. But I think once again, and I suppose the only comment I would give, and it is a general comment, but I think when the Minister was here on the 4th of March, like he went on record say that, you know, the reductions to sentence, the early years, the primary monitoring languages, the furniture and equipment, all of those are specific to the exceptional circumstances, and I think he was on record saying this is the most difficult budget that he has had to deliver. So all I would say is that none of those decisions have been made lightly. We have looked very carefully at all aspects of the budget. But in answer to your specific question, Pat, no, I'm certainly not aware in terms of that. But then, as I say, it wouldn't necessarily come to me directly. So, Chair, happy to have that in writing.
Okay, I'm tempted to say a month now. Robin?
Chair, thank you. Thank Trevor and his team for coming up. I do, Chair, want to place the emphasis that you also placed on the early years. And I think early years is such a sensitive. It's absolutely critical that if it is successful, and however it is got out to the early years groups and so on, that is done as a matter of priority, and communication on that area will be, I think, extremely
and to be fair, Chair, I think that the Minister has said that. Certainly I'm aware in terms of AQs that he totally agrees with that position, that it is one of his priorities and it is our number 2 bid. The reason why school surplus is number 1 is because last year we actually had SEN as our top priority, but because in June 2011 effectively the executive gave a commitment to fund the school surpluses. In June monitoring last year, we actually got the school surplus bid. We didn't get the SEN, and it's seen as an executive commitment, so it effectively trumps our internal sort of bidding order. So that's why with school surpluses. But otherwise, I think the Minister would clearly have early years as his number 1 priority.
Trevor, I wonder, could I just ask about the capital build programme for 2015? Is it, I mean, am I right, Philip, it's 55 million, is that the...
for the major works, it's 55 million,
yes. Yes, and what progress towards that, Philip?
Well, I mean, the programme is progressing. That budget is based on effectively prioritising the major works programme. So we are taking any projects that have been announced through the full process, technical feasibility, economic appraisal, a procurement of a design team and completion of the design. So taking it right up to the point where we're ready to go to construction. At that point, we will then assess the budget situation as to whether or not we are able to release the project to the market. But that £55 million budget is based on all of the projects in the plan running to plan effectively. Now, there'll always be issues, things happen, slight delays. At the point where we can see those, we would then look to reallocate any budget that or any surplus that becomes available. But certainly, as we stand at the moment, we're probably slightly over-programmed on the 55 million. But under normal circumstances, it's probably that budget we're on track to spend, I would say.
You're not anticipating any great downturn on the 55 million?
Not any great downturn. I mean, I say it is predicated on a number of fairly major projects getting on site in this financial year. Obviously, if they slip by a month, 2 months, 3 months, that is a loss of a fairly big, because they're big projects. Effectively the spend that was due for March slips into next year, so the impact can become quite big because of the number of those major projects that are going on site. But as we stand at the moment, well, certainly one was signed last week. There are 2 more going out to procurement over the next few weeks. All of that's on track as we stand at the moment. But that's not to say that there can always be problems and can always be issues where major projects are concerned.
Okay. Chair, would we get an update on that programme?
Yeah, we ask. We get that every month. Get that anyway.
We get that anyway. Okay.
Many folks just had. Sandra, do you want to? Yes.
Sorry, my apologies for not being in earlier. And I think probably a lot of the questions I had are asked, but I'll read the answer obviously rather than ask you to answer those again. So if I ask a question, just say already answered. I'm happy enough for that. But with regard to the voluntary exit scheme, what's the yeah? I know I came in the tail end of it, but I just want to make sure. Are the schools can't plan their budget obviously unless they know whether the teachers are being made redundant or not? And is that all confirmed? Do they know the situation as it is? And yeah,
they know the situation as it is, which is
that's my question. Do they know the situation as in how many their budget and how many they need to make redundant?
We have certainly had 211 teaching applications and 209 non-teaching school-based applications, but they have not yet been approved because they are subject to funding.
Yeah.
Yes.
So schools know that, and we have been keeping the employing and funding authorities fully advised as to that situation and asking them to do the same, so that individual schools and individuals within those schools who have made applications know exactly where their application is, what priority their application is, and that we will keep them advised regarding the funding position.
What's the timing of that?
Well, we would hope to have a position where we could write out to schools this week. We intend to write to schools this week to advise them in relation to those that can be approved, and they will be ones that have had development proposals approved by the Minister prior to the 31st of March 2015. So because those decisions were taken prior to this financial year, we're in a position to be able to approve those. So out of the teaching 2011, we're looking at approximately 82 teaching applications which would fall into that category, that they are in development proposals that were approved by the Minister prior to the 31st of March 2015. The rest of the redundancies for teachers will be subject to access to the Public Sector Transformation Fund. So our intention is to write to schools this week to advise them of that situation so that they know exactly where they are, and we will be keeping them advised. It could well be on a weekly, potentially daily basis, depending on how things progress.
Just to clarify that, Chair, the reason why there's a difference is because the decision was made by the Minister before the 31st of March, from my rules that means that that is a 14-15 cost, so that has been charged to the 14-15 budgets of the individual boards. Because the other teachers, we haven't yet made a final decision because they are subject to affordability in terms of the VES and the Stormont House Agreement. Those are in 15-16. So it's all about the timing of the decision. If the decision was made before the 31st of March, which the Minister did make in terms of development proposals, they have been charged to the individual boards in 14-15.
I appreciate there's a different stance. Just to follow up on Sandra's point, in terms of the numbers, again, we've mentioned in terms of the fact that essentially if there's not enough voluntary redundancies coming forward, that will then be a challenge to the individual schools in terms of their budgets in that regard. Would some schools be faced with a situation that if they're not getting the voluntary redundancies, that they essentially then got to step in and make compulsory redundancies?
Well, the situation is that the redundancies that have been identified by boards of governors are effectively compulsory redundancies. They are redundancies that have to be made in order for the school to live within budget. But the process that we operate is one of a transfer redundancy process. So we have volunteers who come forward and volunteer to take that redundancy. So there's a lot of work that has to be done by the employing authorities to match up the identified redundancies in the schools that need to make those redundancies in order to live within budget, and the individuals who have volunteered for redundancy. So that matching exercise has been ongoing for the last number of months. So the school that makes the redundancy may not actually have the individual teacher.
I understand that,
forward.
but I mean, will there be, from that perspective, do you feel there will be enough there to be able to do that, or will that?
Well, we have 211 teaching applications, and there are over 400 volunteers in the transfer pool. So the issue is being able to match the individual post to an individual teacher, and certainly that's the situation that the employing authorities are managing at the moment. With regards to the numbers, again, just to be clear, 211 teaching applications, of which 82 relate to decisions that the Minister made regarding development proposals prior to the 31st of March 2015. When it comes to the non-teaching staff, we have, out of the 209 applications, 56 posts would be as part of school development proposals approved by the Minister prior to the 31st of March this year.
Yeah, sorry, just again to follow up, and I think Jonathan would in that point. I appreciate
it's all right.
Jumping in, but it's on the subject matter. You mentioned about the 82. Obviously, then, if those are in development proposals, they're presumably not part of the voluntary redundancy scheme, are they, or who's paying for those?
Yes, they're part of the voluntary redundancy scheme, but they're not being funded from the Public Service Transformation Fund.
Is it then who's actually then paying for those?
Well, they're being charged, so they're being paid by the boards, and we funded the boards for those costs out of the 14-15 budget.
Okay,
so I suppose
have those been allocated already then? No.
Yes. Okay. So all say 211 teachers will leave at the end of August. What's happened is because whatever 80 odd of them, the decisions relate to the development proposals, and similarly for the non-teaching staff, those costs have been charged into the 14-15 accounts, because that's when the decision was made. That's the determination we have in terms of our accounting rules. The other 120 odd teachers, those decisions have not yet been made because they are subject to affordability under the VES, and those would be charged to 15-16 to the VES scheme.
John wanted on that point, was it?
Yeah, it's just a point of clarification, as I was listening with interest to Laverne. Obviously, it's actually the school curriculum which actually dictates who can and who can't go, Laverne. But just as a point of clarification, I think we need to be certain about this. It is actually, whether it's classified as voluntary or compulsory, it has little relevance, because isn't it true, Laverne, that it actually is the post that must not only be declared redundant, but must disappear from within the school?
Yes.
For it to be an effective savings to the department?
And that's a very important. Sorry, that's a very important distinction, because, as Laverne says, you know, we have roughly 200 posts and say 400 volunteers, but the post is the key determinant in terms of the cost reduction. If you had the other way around, which we had, say, 100 volunteers and 200 or 300 posts, you'd be in a reverse situation there in terms of insufficient volunteers. But, you know, when we were here last June, one of the key things is that the number of volunteers is misleading. It's the number of posts that the schools are putting forward, because as the post is being made redundant, hopefully filled by a volunteer. That's the key determinant in terms of the cost reduction exercise.
That's very useful to clarify in that
Thank
regard.
you, Chair.
Okay. Sandra, sorry,
Yes.
I'll hand you back. Obviously.
Thank you. No, that's fine. We can all work together as a committee. That's the way it works. No, thank you.
Hopefully nobody will be made redundant on that basis.
Very good. And again, I don't expect you to answer this question twice, but the early years bid, so you have that in, and those early years provisions that have not obviously got the money they wanted, will they have to put in a new application, or what way is that?
I said earlier, in terms of, I think both Pat and I can't remember, was it Jonathan or Sean, or asked, no, sorry, it was yourself, Chair. I don't have enough detail, Sandra, to actually know in terms of what the Minister's views
I think, Sandra,
are.
we got one of the bits was, I think there's a few various items arising.
Yes, in terms of,
maybe at the end of it, I'll get
I'm not close enough to know the
one of those
process.
was the department to come back to us with how it intends to operate any additional funding from the early
Okay,
years.
and finally, then the bids for capital spend. The last time that you were in front of the committee, we talked about there was 20 that had been included previously, and then there was a waiting list as such. Is that waiting list to be reprioritised, or will the ones that were at the top be the next ones to go?
School enhancement programme you're talking about?
Programme,
yeah. The bid for school enhancement programme is based on the 22 that are gone or already gone. They're released. The 13 then have been designed and are ready to go to procurement that are held. The bid is based on all of those effectively going, so asking for the capital we would need to get those on site in year and the money we would spend in year. So it's the same 13 as we had before. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks,
Okay.
Chair. Thanks.
Finally, I just want to touch on with you is just in terms of some of the arm's length bodies. I suppose you can just give us a bit of advice to see, I suppose, really where there's either emerging pressures or savings to be made. Maybe just outline a wee bit where we are with the budget setting process for the Education Authority, and I suppose particularly mention, I think Laverne mentioned earlier about the 250. Obviously, one of the bits in terms of staff savings was that in terms of the business case was about 13%. Would that meet that 13%, or where are we with regard to that? And in terms of any targets or extrapolations that the Education Authority is faced with in terms of its budget?
Certainly, Chair. In relation to the business case, the focus was very much on savings at the most senior levels within the Education Authority, and it was a reduction along the lines of from 55 to 22 posts, so that certainly would be where the focus is. But because this is a voluntary exit scheme, the expressions of interest, those 250 expressions of interest, will come from right across the Education Authority. There may be some school-based in there that are funded by the Education Authority, but in the main they will be headquarters, what we would call headquarters staff across the Education Authority. It will be for the authority to examine those expressions of interest and see where they can afford, and when I say afford, I mean in the sense of being able to continue to deliver a service where they can allow people to go. So it will be very much the Education Authority themselves who will make those decisions.
Then I suppose just in terms of those three other bodies that, one sort of emergent, the other two existing. In terms of the business case, obviously there was due to be a review of the functions on CCMS and NICE, and just wondering, has that taken place, and arising out of that in terms of the in-year budget, is there any anticipated savings on that side of it?
I'm not close enough, Chair. Certainly, I'm aware that work's ongoing. I don't know the actual position and
again, it may be
clarification. I'm certainly not aware in terms of either CCMS or NICE that there is any substantive emerging pressure. No, and clearly they, like all of our NDBBs...
Well, I suppose to be fair, I asked in terms of you say emerging pressure, which is suppose the other side of the coin, but is there any related saving that you're aware of within either of those bodies?
Well, I'm not close enough to know in terms of whether the review was there. Certainly, from my perspective, we weren't anticipating. We have whatever the allocation for each of those bodies, and I don't have the information right in front of me in terms of whether they got savings or not. But certainly, from our perspective, the one thing we have made clear to all our NDPPs, including the authority, is you must live within your allocated budget. I'm not clear whether the purpose of the reviews was to identify, if you like, further savings, but clearly, if Peter wants to contact
again,
us...
if we'll try and get some... Sorry, Laverne?
I can update you in relation to those 2 or 3 reviews. There was a review of NICE, CNG and CCMS. The review of NICE and CNG those reviews are complete, and the CCMS review is ongoing. With regards to the NICE and CNG reviews, the sponsor teams within the department are working with the organisations regarding implementing the recommendations from those reviews.
And you're pleased to hear the very final question, just in relation to, I suppose, the other side of it as part of the Education Act I was going through, was the creation of the Controlled Schools Support Council. I'm just checking, first of all, has the business case for it been approved? And in terms of, is there any projected spend for CSSC this year?
I'm not clear in terms of where we are with the business case. I know one of the issues that we are in discussion with DFP is how that body is actually classified, in terms of whether it is a non-departmental public body or whether it's a third-party organisation, and that's an ongoing discussion we're currently having. In terms of the budget, is it about 1.5? Is it?
Around circa 1 million.
In terms of the allocation.
Discussions regarding.
Well, now, there's a budget that's been put in place and I appreciate you seem to be a little bit unclear as to where the business case is in relation to that, but is it likely then that $1 million will be spent, or is it simply ring-fenced, or what's likely to happen there, do we know?
Well, certainly, if the amount would have been allocated against it, so it's there to spend. I'm not close enough to know in terms of whether, what they're spending.
I appreciate there's probably a number of the areas that we've asked on a range of things which I suppose lie a little bit outside your direct remit in that regard. I suppose it may be useful in relation to if the clerk could maybe outline, there's a number of, and obviously we can pick up anything on Hansard if anything's been missed, but I don't know, Peter, if you want to indicate any... Oh, sorry? Okay, we'll clarify then after that. Okay. Thank you. I suspect you'll be getting a few letters from us in terms of pieces of information in that regard, but thank you for your evidence.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
If you're demolishing the chairs, you're going to have to make that out of your furniture budget.
It was fine when I said it.
Okay, I'll pass it. And there may be other items that want to raise out of this, but perhaps if Peter, if you could outline for us. I mean, there were a number of issues there which came up where we were seeking them. I suppose, to be fair, they weren't in a position to provide us with detail, and we're seeking further information on. I don't know if you can maybe... will be a minute or two yet, just I think.
Just give us a minute.
Just will be a few minutes yet, just.
Oh, we should. Should we wait?
That's okay. We'll give you a shout because I also want to get once we've got this item, we'll go back and get the minutes cleared, etc. At this stage as well.
Yes, Chair. Absolutely.
We haven't actually done that yet.
Absolutely right. Yeah, Chair. So, if the committee are content to write to the department seeking information on a number of issues, firstly, the issue around the change to the staff complement in the department, which the member asked about. Principally about the early years pathways, which I understand is that's what it says in the bid, is the follow-up to the early years fund and details about whether that's going to be open or closed or what have you.
What the process is, yeah.
Indeed. And indeed the primary modern languages programme, I think members had asked, had the department considered reasons for the reintroduction of the programme. I suggest, Chair, maybe it might be useful to get an update from the department on the redundancies. Just there were a number of numbers there that were given, and just to get clarity on what's school-based, what is not, etc. And additionally, on the reviews of Synergy, NICE, there are apparently recommendations. Members might wish to see those and seek an update on the CCMS review, and finally on the CCSC business case.
Okay. I think the other item, just and I appreciate, obviously, there's, like everything, there'll be a long wish list for all of us in terms of, but presumably also I think it may be probably useful to put on the record in terms of the bid that has been put in by the department on it. I mean, I'm presuming it all seems very sort of very worthy things that they're being seen. I presume we're happy to support the monitoring round bid in as far as it goes in that regard. I appreciate there may be other aspects we'd ideally have liked added to it, but I don't think there's anything we disagree with in terms of the bid. Okay.
Robin, I think.
Robin, go on.
Chair, maybe Peter could update me in terms of when do we get the info on the capital budget? How often do we get that?
We get that every month. If you look at page 64 of your packet of the April version, so we get that there's one just appeared just yesterday. It's all nicely colour-coded and hopefully is understandable, but it only gives you the new builds. It doesn't give you, I don't think it gives you the school enhancement programme or minor works.
That was my next question in line with Sean's comments there. Can we ask, Chair, within that list about the schools enhancement programme as well?
Okay.
13, I think, wasn't it? 13?
13, yeah.
13, yeah.
We're probably keeping at least a few people in employment in the Department of Education in terms of the responses. Anybody else have any other issues they want to raise arising out of the budgetary side of things? Members, just before we bring in the next session, just return briefly. Whenever we started the session, we were enough to get the meeting started, but not enough to take decisions. So I just referred items 2, 3 and 4. First of all, in terms of the Chair's business, I suppose just place on record contribution of all members to the debate on the 1st of June. And I think thank you for your contributions. Obviously, the Minister gave sort of a verbal response in his speech, but it may be useful as we produce the position paper, if members are in agreement, to write to the Department seeking a formal written response to the recommendations that we put forward, if members are agreeable with that.
Fine.
Okay. Then also just remind members, we've been informed that in relation to the and again, this is one of those sort of cross-departmental issues of the Marshall Report, which is dealing with tackling child sexual exploitation. The, I suppose, lead department for that is Health, and they've issued an implementation plan for the health and social care aspects of the Marshall Report. And it may be worthwhile if we write to the department seeking an update of those recommendations made by ETI for schools and youth settings as part of the Marshall Report, so to make sure that everything is moving sort of together, again, if members are agreed with that. Okay. Then, just draft minutes of the meeting, referred to page 6 in table pack. Are members agreed that those are complete and accurate record?
Yeah.
Okay, so, just in terms of matters of writing, because obviously there's various other items we're dealing with, there's a refer members to the cover note at page 12. We've received a further response to the SEND bill committee stage. And there's also tabled items from another parent in relation to the SEND Code of Practice. If we could just formally seek agreement that we note those 2 items and add them to the bill's submissions. Members are agreeable?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, that's complete. Unless anybody else has any other matters arising for the minutes. Okay, well then we'll return to the next item on the agenda, which is the world around us. At item 6, and we'll invite in our witnesses. Just before our witnesses come in, remind members that there's a cover note at page 76 in relation to that, and there's also a paper that's been provided by ETI, and there's also other relevant papers. And I'd like to welcome the following officials. We have Noel Buick, of the Chief Inspector of the Education ETI, David Hughes, who's Director of Curriculum, Qualifications and Standards at the Department of Education, Fiona MacArthur, who is also from the Education and Training Inspectorate, and Nicola Byrne, who is also with the Education and Training Inspectorate. And Vice, maybe to make a short opening statement, and then there'll be members will want to.
Yes, thank you.
Good
morning. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members. Thank you for the opportunity to share the findings of the Education and Training Inspectorate's evaluation of the implementation of the world around us in primary schools. Chair, you've already done some introductions. If I could just elaborate and say Fiona MacArthur was the reporting inspector for the report, and my colleague from ETI, Nicola Byrne, is a science specialist who inspects in primary, post-primary and further education. The Department of Education commissioned ETI to conduct this evaluation in the academic year 2013-14, and the purpose of the evaluation was to find out how primary schools are implementing and developing this area of learning, and the quality of the world around us provision. And we wanted to ascertain the views of practitioners as to the strengths and areas for improvement within what is a relatively new combination of disciplines in the context of the Northern Ireland curriculum. The evaluation had 4 main components. There was ETI visits to a sample of 35 primary schools of varying size, sector and geographical spread. We also carried out 150 direct classroom observations of the world around us across the foundation stage and key stage 1 and 2. We also had consultation with a wide range of stakeholders, and it wasn't just confined to science organisations. We also included the education and library boards, as they were then, SEA, the specialist inspectors of history, geography and science, and then the members of the professional organisations such as the Association for Science Education and the Primary Science Teachers Trust in Northern Ireland. And my colleagues Fiona and Nicola met recently with a number of them at science dissemination events. We also had 300 questionnaire returns and associated extended responses completed by principals and staff in the schools. And these were confidential. The responses were independently analysed by NISRA, and the identity of the schools was not made known to ETI. So the evaluation identified that within the world around us, schools felt more confident about the quality of their provision in history and geography and the wider thinking skills and personal capabilities. That's working with others, managing information, problem solving and being creative, than in the quality of provision for science and technology. Also, 46% of the schools that responded to the web-based survey felt the current world around us planning did not provide sufficient opportunities for the steady progression of the relevant practical and experiential science and technology skills. In relation to the 3 contributory strands of history, geography, science and technology, it's important that schools have the flexibility to tailor the curriculum to the needs and interests and abilities of their children, and then can set this work in a familiar context to ensure that the children benefit from a balanced and coherent approach to the world around us learning experiences. Of the 150 lessons that we observed, over half were science and technology based, 54% of them, and half of those were concerned with physical science. And 86% of the science and technology based lessons were evaluated as good or better, with over half, 56%, being very good or outstanding. And you'll meet some of these schools this afternoon at the celebration event for very good and outstanding schools, where we recognise the valuable contribution they've made to education in Northern Ireland. But we can conclude that in most of the schools where science lessons were observed, the teachers demonstrated the skills and understanding needed to bring about effective provision for children. The evaluation also highlighted in over 30% of schools that the teachers felt they did not have sufficient skills and knowledge to teach science and technology with confidence. And it's important to know this is about confidence, not about ability or the qualifications to teach the science and technology strand. And I think this finding has important implications for the development and training of teachers. Most of the schools, 76%, reported that they identify and address their world around us staff development needs in a variety of ways, including in-house training, for example, by the coordinator, supported by external bodies such as the National Science Learning Centre, the Association for Science Education, the Education Authority and various private consultants. But it is significant that only 37% of schools who responded to the web survey reported that they had staff that had completed STEM training from these providers. And alongside this, 24% emphasised the need for further professional development and for more opportunities to work with other schools. In particular, the schools require significant further support and training in planning and evaluating the world around us provision. And the self-evaluation audit tool that was developed by ETI during this evaluation has been made available to schools and is being used by a number of those schools to support their self-evaluation and improvement work. You'll note that the report has identified a number of recommendations for the Department of Education, for ETI, for SEA and for schools, and as I say, they're outlined in the report. And the ETI has begun to address the recommendations which pertain to our work. So that was just a brief introduction to the World Around Us report. I'm now going to hand over to Dr Hughes, who was going to make a short introduction in relation to the department. Thank you.
Okay. At the outset, I'd say that the department is very pleased to have this report from the Inspectorate. It's a very important contribution to our own thinking about how the statutory curriculum is being delivered in this area, and it will inform our consideration of how this area of learning ought further to be addressed in the primary phase. The picture it paints is one where there is a lot of good work going on in primary schools, but there is clearly room for improvement, for real transformative development of teaching and learning in schools. I'm impressed by the examples of good practice, impressed by the evidence of teachers who've really grasped the opportunity offered by our curriculum to deliver excellent teaching and learning. And I'm struck by the capacity within our own school system to step up to that challenge of the curriculum and show others within the system what can be done. In your letter, the clerk raised a number of questions for the department. Happy to address these at the outset. You ask in what in practical terms is meant by encouragement and support. Well, I think it means a range of things. I think the first point is the encouragement that should come from the interest of the Minister and the Department, of this committee, of others, in the delivery of this area of the curriculum. The fact that we have this report from the Inspectorate to look at the world around us, we're keen to see its findings disseminated and discussed. I think that is significant, and I think it will be understood by schools as significant. In a way, this begins to answer your second question as well. How we emphasise the importance of this area of the curriculum. Well, the first way we do that is drawing attention to it in this way, with this report, with these findings. I think there is also an important message to be conveyed by school leaders, by employers, by parents, by others, about the place of these skills and this learning in the primary phase. So if nothing else, I would expect this report should cause principals and governors to look very carefully at their own provision, to consider what more may be done in their own school and through their planning. In terms of support, I believe there is work to be done to ensure that schools are better aware of the opportunities that exist for developing their delivery of this area of the curriculum. Clearly, there's a role for the Education Authority and for SEER. There's a role for many of the organisations who work to support primary schools in this area. There's a role for the Inspectorate in bringing examples of good practice to the fore. There is, of course, there's the capacity of C2K to deliver resources and examples of effective practice into every school. And there's the expertise, there's the experience of colleagues in neighbouring schools to which teachers and principals can reach out. There are still some centrally funded interventions, including the STEM Truck, the Sentinels programmes, some, of course, which have been geared primarily towards post-primary schools, but which have been available to primary schools as well. But of course, the bulk of resource for teacher professional development actually rests with schools, both in terms of their own budgets and in terms of the time available through in-service training and school development days. So I think that goes some way to answer your query about how schools are able to access resources and expertise. There are resources available. There's a job of work to ensure that schools are aware of what is out there, what other schools are demonstrating is possible. There are a couple of questions in respect of SEER. I've sought their response to those too. You asked whether it was feasible for SEER to provide more detailed guidance, and if so, how and when. I think firstly, I want to respond to the point made to the committee by PSTT that the only teacher resources that SEER has produced are the 5 booklets. We assume those are referring to the STEM thematic units. In addition to that, SEER do produce other things. There are 19 areas for connected learning presented. There are 6 primary update activities. There's the Out of This World Key Stage 2 resource. There are 2 story sacks based on science content. There are, of course, Key Stage 3 resources, which may well be relevant in the planning and preparation and what teachers are looking for. Now, certainly, if the department were to commission SEER to produce additional guidance material, that would be possible, but of course, it would have to be funded or delivered in preference to another aspect of a work programme that's been set for this year. No decision has yet been taken to do so. It is worth reminding the committee the importance that schools have placed upon being able to develop their own school curriculum, being able to access resources in line with their knowledge of their own pupils and staff. And I think I'd be reluctant to propose that SEAR simply steps in, takes over that, and provides pre-prepared work isolated from the experience and needs of specific schools, interests and expertise of specific teachers. I think that possibly would also do some disservice to the superb resources available from others, including PSTT, NSLC and others. Now, there may well be a place for more developed exemplification of the progression of the concepts from foundation stage to key stage 2. That would be possible. And there's potential role for SEAR in supporting schools to deliver literacy, numeracy, through science, through history, through geography, through topics that are in those areas, just as they should in other curriculum areas too. So I think the final point I'd make is to reflect on the conclusion of the report, that the schools where the teaching and learning was most effective have been where the principles underpinning our statutory curriculum have been thoroughly adopted, thoroughly exemplified, and where the quality of teaching is high. And I think these 2 points are the key to supporting and encouraging the delivery of the world around us, a good application of the curriculum and securing of better and better teaching.
Okay, thank you folk, for that. I mean, could I first of all say I very much welcome the report that is in front of us, a very thorough piece of work. And I suppose we've heard, both in terms of evidence that's been put before us and I suppose in individual capacities, what we've heard today, what we've heard on a more empirical basis, I think has been then is sort of very clearly established in terms of the report then itself, which I suppose does show, I mean, I think everyone will acknowledge there's a lot of good work getting done by individuals within the system, but there's no doubt that in many ways it is showing that the teaching of science side of it is there is a level of gap within that, and it is the weak link in the chain, I think, within the world around us. I suppose maybe we can start off with David, and thank you for your remarks in relation to that. I did note some might regard it as a slight degree of euphemism of saying that there's room for further improvement, of being a slight degree of underestimate in that regard. I appreciate, David, you had to be very, because obviously there's a very short time frame in terms of the initial presentations, you had to be quite broad brush. So I'm sure you'll be very keen to sketch in some of the details on some of these things. I suppose, first of all, does the Department now, as a result of this report, concede that there is action that's required to improve the delivery of science in primary schools?
I certainly think that what the report done is showed where the work needs to be done. Because I think the fact that there are such good examples, but they are only examples, and there is plenty of evidence where those good examples can be learnt from, where the model of good practice and good teaching needs to be picked up by more teachers. So yes, I think there is. We do recognise that this is giving us a very clear indication that there is more to be done.
Yes, although in terms of that, and would you accept then that while there's different components of this in terms of different points down the route in which it's got to be done, that there's a specific role, obviously, of action for the department to take in connection with this, so that it can't simply be. I mean, it seemed, with respect, an awful lot of messages going out there. We didn't really have a great deal of meat on the substance of action.
But I think there is an important point there about what the role of the department in this would be, and I think the first, and I'm making it clear, it is the first point. The first role of the department is underlining the importance of this area of the curriculum, so it shouldn't be neglected, and it shouldn't be left undeveloped.
And other than general encouragement, how does actually the department intend to do that? What practical measures are going to be taken?
Well, we haven't sort of drawn up an action plan arising from the report. I think we need to consider what is possible. I think the very clear indication that there is a role there for SEAR in providing results, I think is a very helpful steer, and what that kind of input from SEAR might be that will most effectively support the improvement of the teaching and learning. So that, I think, that's a very important point that the department will be taking into its consideration in response to the report.
Well, in terms of response, I mean, maybe you're not in a position to do this, maybe this will be in terms of the response to the report. In terms of the recommendations of the report, is the department in a position to indicate that it is accepting the recommendations, or is that will that flow from whatever response you give?
I think what we need to do is we need to formulate the response very specifically, because I think the recommendations are quite high level, and I think we recognise that, and quite reasonably, because it would have been a shame for the inspectorate to said, here are some specific things that the department should do to respond to what the findings of the report, but the department turn around and say, well, actually, well, we're not going to do that, we're going to do this, or that then becomes that's an unhappy situation. What they've pointed to is what the department should be supporting, encouraging, drawing attention, bringing the focus back onto this area of the curriculum if it has been lost in some places, and the department's very clear that it wants to do that.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll just ask another couple of questions just before I open it up to other members in that regard. Rising out of that, one criticism has been, and again, whether this is a part of the all-encompassing response to the report, has been in terms of the world around us, and I appreciate there are different views within this, but simply drawing together the three subjects into one in an umbrella-type fashion, there is clearly and understandably reference being made to the confidence of teachers in delivery in terms of different reports on the science side, and perhaps a concern over that. There has been indications given that because of that, maybe sort of arising out of that, there's at times in different schools there's been an emphasis on the history and geography side of it at the expense of science. Now, certainly some within the broad sort of science teaching community and those from a science background would say actually the problem is in terms of the curriculum itself, putting the three under the one umbrella, that a science needs to be separated out from history and geography and given a specific place. As a department, any thoughts on whether it intends to alter the curriculum itself to accommodate that, or are you committed to the world around us in terms of as an umbrella, or is that again something that you would be responding to as part of the wider response on that?
I think we can go back to why it is that what we'd recognise perhaps later on in schools as separate subjects. Actually, in primary school, this is an area of the curriculum. There is a reason why science, history, geography, those themes, those things are kept together. Because the history and geography provides the context very often in which science skills and science understanding can be developed and taught. So to separate them out, I'm not sure necessarily would be a positive step, because in actual fact having them together is in itself a valuable thing. I think the very good practice that the inspectorate has found has been where that is, as it were, it is seamless, it is natural, and it works, and that schools can deliver very effectively the scientific elements because they are delivering them in the world around us context. So what I think would be the risk of separating out subjects, which is possibly not necessarily the right terminology for a primary school anyway, would be to isolate sciences from the other areas of the world around us. That would seem to be a bit of a retrograde step. I think there is also a very important...
In one sense, David, maybe, I mean, I'm not either advocating one way or the other, but if you're saying a retrograde step, some would say that if you have a situation in which it is simply part as one of three and it is therefore put at the back burner of the three, that is a retrograde step for science.
But Chair, I would say that's not the findings in the report, and Fiona, my colleague who undertook the work, would be able to give some more detail on that. And we found that the thematic approach of combining, science, history and geography together made the subject come alive for pupils. It meant that they could investigate on a thematic approach, have a project-based approach, really get into hands-on study in a cohesive way that wouldn't happen if the subjects were separated out. And if you don't mind, maybe Fiona would like to elaborate on that, because I think that would maybe put your mind at ease about science being underplayed within the world around us.
Good morning, Chair and
Thank you.
Committee. No, I would certainly agree with Noel that in the very best practice we see teachers who understand high quality learning and teaching, and that if you think of the world around us working out from the child at the centre from the very early stages in preschool, it is really about the teachers understanding the progression in the learning of the contributory strands. So, for example, there are historical skills to be taught and learned, rather than just focusing on the content of the topic, which is very, very important. That how does a historian think? How do you rely on first-hand evidence and use it to inform your decisions? Again, if we focus on the science, it is really about the teachers coming to a point of confidence where they know and understand the progression in the concepts. And at the moment, we are seeing that in the very best practice, where we see outstanding practice. Schools at this point, and if you see this report really as a baseline, which has been highly informative for the system, and schools are constantly in contact with me saying we are happy that the profile has been raised on this learning area, but it is for them to decide how to achieve the balance and blend across the 3 contributory strands to bring them together in a way that is coherent for the children. And at this point in time, schools are saying we need to be clear about the progression in the learning.
Well, is there an argument in terms of, if we accept that there's a need potentially for the 3 to be kept within the same sort of subject matter, shall we say, in that broader level, in terms of expanding the baseline? Because again, part of the problem is that we seem to have a partial situation in which some schools, undoubtedly this is taught very well, that is very well integrated, that there's a good emphasis on science, in others are clearly lagging behind in relation to that for a variety of reasons. Is there merit then in terms of that, and appreciate indication given of the level of flexibility that's given the schools on it, but being a little bit more prescriptive and actually saying within the context of the world around us of setting some level of targets for the baseline of at least the science content of that?
Well, I think the audit tool, which forms part of this report, schools really need to be very honest with themselves to say where are we actually in terms of staff development needs, in terms of the range and blend of the learning, that they really need to be looking to say, yes, there is a good balance and blend across the history, geography and science. And we're very clear because, in my view, the schools that get this and understand it, they realise that they are building science thinkers and doers. They understand that you really develop that awe and wonder factor, as I would call it. There's nothing more delightful than going into a preschool in Ballymoney on a December morning where children are able to explain to me why when they bring the snow inside it can melt. And they're hooked. And the moment is taken, and they are learning scientifically, and it's related to their everyday experiences. It's about teachers being confident about building that learning journey. And I do think that the guidance from SEA is helpful. I do know for a fact that many of our teachers still refer back to what we would call the previous guidance, which was more expanded, in which there is more progression guidance. But our teachers want to do this well, and I think at the moment there's a real hunger for teachers to be well informed, to be well equipped, and they really do want to be making a good job of this.
Yeah, I'll maybe come in. I know David's looking in, but maybe just wrap this up in that regard. I mean, it's critical. One of the issues, as you've highlighted, you mentioned about the preschool. I mean, a lot of the evidence will suggest. I mean, I suppose as an assembly, we'll quite often be looking at what we do in terms of STEM subjects, and a lot of the focus at times will be on what happens at university, what happens at further and higher education, what happens in secondary schools. But with a lot of subjects, and if you talk to people who are involved in, just in terms of, I mean, most people's memories even of school in terms of where their particular interest was ignited in a subject will come from either, well, sometimes the preschool period, but particularly the primary school period. It's maybe a particular teacher, a particular subject, and whether it's history or whatever. And to some extent, if we don't get it right at primary level...
Chair, what I would say, certainly in agreement with that statement, is that when we have young people making decisions about science at age 14, it's an imperative then that they have those high quality learning experiences in the primary, so that by the end of P7, for example, they know what a scientist does, they know which range of employment contains science, and that's already part of their learning experience in the primary school, because very quickly by the end of Key Stage 3 they're having to make decisions. So unless we capture that within those early experiences... And
one consistent theme though seems to be coming out from various sources that we have. You've mentioned about a certain level of hunger from teachers. They're also, though, from a number of sources, seems to be a clear indication that there's a lack of confidence, that they don't feel perhaps, whatever the hunger, that there's maybe enough support for them, that they're getting the level of knowledge. I mean, I suppose a situation where its ability is often outstripping confidence within the teaching profession. I suppose in the political profession it's quite often the reverse case, where confidence sometimes outstrips ability. But I suppose seriously on that basis, in terms of the professional development side of it, maybe this is really directed towards David. I mean, what specific actions is the department potentially going to be taking, or is it, again, this part of the overall encompassing bit, to actually then focus a greater emphasis on CPD for the science side, and in particular also, I suppose, mentioned being where there are in a number of schools, there's actually particular elements of good practice. I saw last Friday, for instance, in terms of some of the activities that are going on between Stranmillis and certain primary schools on that basis, where they have a sort of a shared experience bit of having students who are well versed in science, then having a mutual learning experience, if you like, with experienced teachers who maybe were lacking confidence, and pairing those people up was very useful. Could you outline specifically at this stage, has the department any thoughts on how it can actually boost the CPD side of it on the science side of things at primary level?
Well, you've brought the question right back to where I was hoping to come in as well, because the term confidence, the word confidence is absolutely critical here, because you started by referring to the differential between history, geography and science elements within the world around us. And I think that differential exists at its greatest in the confidence of the teachers in delivering it. Not necessarily the ability of the teachers to deliver it, but the confidence in delivering it. And I think one of the key findings of the report is that a good science teaching in primary school comes from a good primary school teacher. Doesn't necessarily have to be an expert scientist. After all, this is primary school, and it is actually the expertise in teaching which is so important. And I think the first point that needs to be made is that confidence can be acquired, not necessarily through becoming more scientifically qualified, but through the confidence that in delivering this element of the world around us, teachers can do it well. So I think some of the conversation that's taken place around, well, how many science specialists are there in the school, actually become less important, but how many confident science teachers there are in a primary school. I think in terms of CPD, I think what I'm not going to announce is a programme of CPD arising from this report, because I'm not sure that necessarily is the right answer. I think there is a lot of resource available for schools to access, and I think there is a piece of work to be done to make sure that schools know what is available to access. And it's not just it's not just provision from outside organisations, but it's also the school down the road who's doing it very well. And I think that is a line of consideration the department will be giving more attention to, is there are schools who are showing really excellent work, and they're not that far from other schools.
Again, David, this also ties into, I suppose, another issue which will be hopefully coming before the committee fairly soon, which is obviously the department fairly soon will be publishing its legislation on shared education, which, while there's I suppose two elements to things. There's the element of a broader community relations type side of it, but also then the idea in which schools in many ways should be actually cross-fertilisation and learning from each other in that regard. I mean, I don't know, again, that this may be something outside your remit. I think that's something also maybe we have come in to be borne in mind when we're looking at shared education, where, particularly on the science side of it, where we can actually have that degree of flow between schools, and a sort of a I think the phrase used last, I think, was sort of like a learning circle type of thing, where different schools can actually benefit from each other, where there are perhaps strengths and weaknesses.
I think I'd pick up 2 points. Firstly, I think World Around Us, where there is already sharing between primary schools, World Around Us is a very common, or at least fairly familiar, part of the curriculum that is done on a shared basis. Secondly, that the experience of post-primary schools in working in clusters has been very positive indeed. there has been some piloting of clustering of primary schools related to the clustering of post-primary schools. That's at a very early stage, and it's tentative. Some areas are quite advanced in their own way, but actually seeing more of that is something that that would be a very positive step forward. And of course, there's also accessing from primary schools to post-primary schools expertise, enthusiasm, equipment, and so on. So there are a number of ways in which schools can be helping each other between primaries and post-primaries, and I think there is real strength in that.
Yeah, I was just going to say I would add, you know, in terms of the good practice that we identified through inspection, there's 3 examples in the report that teachers can look at in terms of good practice in teaching the world around us. We also, on inspection, have identified good practice that we're going to film and put on ESAG's TV. And I know Nicola has a specific example of clustering that works particularly well in the North East. You know, so there are lots of opportunities to pick up good practice and use it.
I mean, in terms of the report, confidence is the main issue. In terms of seeing the quality of the provision observed is very high. We see some very good practice, highly effective practice in the teaching of science concepts and world around us concepts in general. In terms of confidence, however, that is an area that is impacting on teachers' capacity to deliver it well, and at times then to maybe put science a little on a back burner. And therefore it is really important, and a key recommendation of this report, that the confidence issue is addressed. In looking at current practice, we see schools coming together to do joint planning or to do team teaching within schools. So there's a range of initiatives taking place within schools and across schools to support the development of confidence in this area. In terms of the shared education, Chair, that you've mentioned, ATI have undertaken some baseline inspections for the Delivering Social Change shared education work. And within that, we are seeing very commonly the PDMU or World Around Us work as being the focus on which the schools are sharing, particularly the expertise of teachers, the resources that are available, and also to come together to plan thematically. Particularly I'm thinking of within a local context of areas of science of particular interest to the children and particular relevance and real life context for science. All of that augurs extremely well for the children's motivation and enthusiasm for science. In terms then also, North East region had set up some clusters between primary schools and post-primary, where, for example, a post-primary school would be linked to around 4 or 5 of its contributory feeder primaries, and some excellent work was undertaken there to ensure progression at the transition, but also to support, in a very mutually beneficial way, science provision to ensure high-quality learning experiences. So some excellent work undertaken there.
Okay, we have a number of members. Jonathan, first of all.
Thank you, Chair. Well, David, good to see you back here. An interesting report, I would have to say. Whether I would describe it as good or not is another matter. He's tried to argue there that science is not the poor relation in this, but yet there's some fascinating figures in there. There's an ETI report which says science is underdeveloped in 54% of primary schools. In your own report, you're actually indicating there's only 3% of primary school teachers who actually hold any sort of science qualification, and there's only 37% of staff have done the STEM training. That doesn't really bode very well for the teaching of science in this curriculum. So what actions are going to be taken by us? Because I'm not here to criticise how it is. What actions are going to be taken to actually turn this around? Because I see a lot of worrying things. You know, you're talking about self-evaluation in your recommendations. And I'm going self-evaluation, that could mean anything. To inform staff of a development programme. So in other words, there isn't a development programme. Now, what's going to be done by yourselves to actually drive that forward? and it must come from more than just self-evaluation.
Maybe I'll start, and my colleagues would want to come in. I think I'd like to sort of balance, what you say with some of the positives in the report. We did observe 150 lessons, 54% of those were science, and 86% of those were good or better. So in a sort of a sample of schools, not chosen in any particular way, we did see some really good science teaching. We also saw that 67% of teachers felt they had the skills and knowledge to teach science and technology, and we saw that 76% had access staff development in a variety of ways to help enhance their teaching in science and technology. So those were sort of real positives in the report. That's not to take away from the fact that we have also identified that broadly 30% feel that they don't have sufficient skills and knowledge to be able to teach the science part of the curriculum, and that's where we really need to focus our attention in highlighting some of the good practice that we've seen in signalling to them that there are these organisations that will provide specific support and training for teachers who do need to develop their confidence. So there is quite a lot out there that probably needs better signposting rather than more of. I don't know if my colleagues would like to.
I think also there's a case for teachers to. Good teaching and learning is good teaching and learning, and in all schools that conversation needs to be had. How do we teach? How do the children learn? What are their needs in this school, in this community at this time? And we do have to dispel the myth that you need to be a physics graduate to teach in a primary school. It's more important that you're a good teacher who, with your colleagues, have planned a good programme, and within that programme you understand the progression in the learning. Primary teachers have to be very good at very many things, and I think that this report is about building their confidence. I would point to some of the very excellent work that, for example, PSTT do in developing teachers, and they would say that core to their work is developing the non-specialist, taking people forward from their position to be able to say, we have the confidence in seeing the science learning potential, this is how we're going to go about it, and their work is developing quite a large number of teachers in that direction. So we would see, we've been in schools where the impact of that is now there, and coming back to the issue of teacher confidence, where you see that through that teachers they can now say, I get it, I feel better about that now. For example, if we look in the foundation stage and we see play-based learning approaches where there's an open-endedness, enabling the children to ask questions, to develop lines of inquiry, to begin to formulate fair testing, to think about all those things. Our primary school teaching force has the capacity to do that. What we need to do is build their confidence and give them the opportunities to share what they can already do and take it forward. And I think this report has opened up the focus on all of that.
Mm-hmm. There's one thing I definitely agree with you there. I think there is the capacity within our primary school teachers to turn this whole situation around. The one disappointing thing that I don't read anywhere in your report is the actual ability for teachers in general to link in with science-based industry experts who will give them some form of guidance or understanding as to what science-based careers are actually out there, because that's the key thing in all of this. We have a science-based industry out there crying out for staff, but cannot get people in a whole raft of science-based skills, just can't get them. We need to influence children in primary school to say these are good careers, and careers which you never dreamt of. So what is it can actually be done, because I don't see it in that report, to actually upskill the teachers in regards to what possibilities are out there for children and what aspirations they can have towards science and what a future. A very clear
part of our evidence base, we talk to groups of Year 7 children in every school, and we talk to them about their aspirations. We talk to them about aspects of the world around us, including their science and technology work, which they enjoyed. We got them to cast their minds forward to careers, and of course there were children saying, I'd really like to be an archaeologist because, and I said, well, what sort of science is involved in that? Well, you have to carbon date things, don't you? And you could, one wee girl said to me she wanted to be a hairdresser, and there was science involved in that because you'd be very careful, health and safety around the chemicals. So our children are making these links. I think we do have to make them more overtly, but certainly through visits and visitors, which our primary schools use very, very well. We are accessing parents who have a science background to come in and talk to the children about the professions. Sentinists come in, they're very keen to promote the role of women and the potential for careers in engineering. They do great work. Bombardier, the kids, I know they go up flying around Strabane, a couple of my schools where they've done that, and that's been across the north of Ireland. So there are examples of that, but certainly there could be more. We could always have more where children see those role models beyond their teachers and have those aspirations. The coding thing, the ICT thing, is certainly an area where we would want to see more happening, and there are the early roots of that. I know, for example, there is a conference planned in Stranmillis University College on the 19th of June, where quite a number of stakeholders with that ICT focus are coming together to show schools what is available for them to bring into the schools. And it's all to be applauded and it's all to be encouraged, certainly.
Yeah. And Noel, just as a last thing, I noticed there in recommendation 9, you're going to try and identify through inspection examples of effective and innovative practice in this field. Are you going to actually share that in an effective means around other schools? And through the influence that you can have, which is unique to yourselves as inspectors, actually try and influence other schools to follow that best practice, because to me that's just common sense almost.
I think that's an important part of our work, promoting improvement, and we would do that in many ways, through the inspection reports themselves and the examples that we would give, because we would look at the world around us on, the primary school inspections, and if we see good practice, we would write about it. We also have, we had dissemination events on the foot of the Chief Inspector's report, and we had 2 primary schools that ran workshops on particularly good practice that they were undertaking in their school, which they shared with the wider primary school community. We also have, as Nicola mentioned, the ESAGS TV, a couple of examples there that we're going to film and put online with a link from the ETI website, as well as the ESAGS TV itself. So, there are, I think, opportunities to disseminate the good practice that we see within the confines of the resources that we have and the time that we have. But, there are, as Fiona said, other conferences and other opportunities and through the networks for teachers to share good practice in other forums too. But it is an important part of our work.
I think as well as a district inspector, we see schools that are quite small, and they at times can then struggle to get the industry links, etc., formed and forged. In terms of looking at the work of area learning communities at post-primary, a very successful element of that work was the engagement in STEM careers education across schools, which led to very many area learning communities putting on careers fairs, etc., and engaging parents and children from very early on in Key Stage 3 in looking very closely at a wide range of STEM opportunities within Northern Ireland, which really widen children's thinking in terms of not just solely looking at medicine, etc., but looking much wider at the potential opportunities here in Northern Ireland. In terms of supporting work in primary to engage in this kind of work, I think there are a number of primary schools who have engaged very well, particularly when there are parental links, that they can engage with local industry, etc., and some very exciting work being undertaken by the likes of Sentinists and PSTT in looking at project works that are looking at renewable energies, the use of plastics, etc., pharmacy, all kinds of contexts within a very local setting. And with that, I think there's still the potential for more in terms of supporting schools to cluster together to get the best in terms of provision for their children.
Okay, next, I'll pass on now. Sean, I think you were next.
Thank you, ladies and David, you're very, very welcome. I suppose the first thing there Noel, was what percentage of schools responded to the web-based survey?
We had 300 responses.
35%, approximately 35%.
So 200, I think it was 291 to be precise.
Yeah.
That's, you know, a sizable number of our primary school cohort responded.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, well then that begins to put things in context. That if you 50% are happy with, in terms of practical aspects of science, and a third return, you're talking about you're talking about a very, very small percentage of schools where this is actually going well. And I think, David, you talked about all our responsibilities in terms of promotion of science and technology and so on, and certainly I don't think you'd find this committee wanting in terms of keeping it high on the agenda. And some of it also comes from our own background, and as I say, within this committee, as a teacher, as somebody who has a science background. But also, when you see our children, and particularly our primary school children, and I think this is a very, very good, it's a good report. I see it as really as a starting point, drawing the line in the sand, because our children at Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 particularly are such sponges for learning.
Absolutely.
And then my background is post-primary, and it's quite difficult for a 14 or 15-year-old boy, and you tell him he needs to do physics, you know, and that hunger hasn't been satisfied in the primary years. So I say thanks for that answer, but it really puts it in context of where we are in terms of the issues and the problems.
I think, you know, I wouldn't want to underplay the positives. You know, there are real positives in this report. You know, we will send out a web-based questionnaire, and it's up to the schools to respond. But I think, you know, a 300 broad responses was pretty high, and gave us a really good indication of what the school's views on the world around us were. And we don't just rely on that, because obviously we look at that on every primary inspection that we undertake. You know, our focus is on literacy and/or numeracy, but we're looking at how those subjects are taught through the various areas of learning. So we're not just relying on what we saw in the World Around Us report.
No, don't get me wrong. I'm not criticising that at all. I'm just thinking it's good to know where the line in the sand is and what we all have to do in terms of improvement. I suppose, Nicola, one question I would have would be, in terms of the schools that were particularly inspected and so on, what was the balance between sort of biological sciences and the chemical and physical sciences in terms of schools?
It is. I heard the comment from PSTT about the need for a look specifically at the physical sciences. I would say that the balance is very, very rounded. In fact, of the lessons that we observed, over half of them were what would have been the context of physical sciences. So there's some excellent work, particularly looking at the likes of energy in a Northern Ireland context, but also some things like Earth and space, and some of those kinds of foci are present in Key Stage 1 and 2.
Forces and energy would be another topic that you would see in schools. And to give them their due, certainly some of the examples of the best work we would have viewed came from teachers who'd been developed through the work of, for example, PSTT, or who had gone across to the National Science Learning Centre in York. So you can see the fruits of their labours, and it's very encouraging to talk to teachers who will say to you, I actually don't have a science background, but they're now enabled to be able to have confidence in teaching these things and going with the children as co-learners almost. And, you know, that's very empowering for teachers to feel that.
You see, I see three very important things here. Nicola, you alluded to it earlier, is that relationship between our post-primary and our primaries, where you have a certain level of science expertise, etc., and that. But also, as Jonathan said, that link, the business link and whatever. But thirdly, yourselves. You have such great expertise, you see such great practice. And I sort of wonder, you know, in terms of when you see the recommendations from ETI, how is this going to be disseminated? Yes, case studies and so on. But how is the experience you and your colleagues see going to be? How can there be a closer link? And there's a bigger issue. How can there be a closer link between your inspectorial role and actually in the role in enhancing and improving teaching and learning in science and the world about us?
I mean, in terms of our role as district inspectors, I take it very seriously that on inspection, that we would have we have a science and technology panel, first of all, within ETI, and within that panel, then any schools in Northern Ireland who are struggling with elements of science provision can call on members of the science and technology panel to have a visit for us to come out and discuss what high quality learning experiences look like for children. In terms of then the use of ESAGs, TV, etc., you're looking for ways of communicating to teachers what this looks like and modelling it, because when it's about confidence, it's not necessarily about having pieces of paper or because they can sit on desks. Key is about modelling what it looks like in the classroom and ensuring then that teachers have the confidence to give it a go. And key here is that science is possible and that science is not. I'm just looking at the likes of it's not nuclear science or it's not science or physical sciences or the tougher sciences. I think we're getting away from that now. As a physicist, physics is straightforward. It is a very logical subject and children can do physics well. And we need to ensure that that message is getting out loud and clear, that it is no more difficult than other subject areas. I cannot draw, so art is the particular subject where I would struggle. But physics, we are looking at a time when physics is a very interesting, enthusiastic and expanding subject area. Every day there's physics material in the news, etc. And key here is for teachers to know that they don't have to know everything, but they have to be able to facilitate the learning for children, but also to be able to tap into expertise when they need it. And that is around us. There is a wealth of expertise within Northern Ireland, and it is about harnessing it, but ensuring that teachers don't feel that they have to know everything.
And if I could just say on top of what Nicola said, increasingly when we're on district visits and in schools, people will say to us, where can I go to see? Our school's working on this now. You're all over Northern Ireland. Could you recommend somewhere where we can go and see? And there is that increasing openness to see resource in their counterparts in other schools. And certainly that is one of the great privileges of our work, that we do get into classrooms and into schools, and we sometimes see wonderful things in places where we didn't expect, and it humbles you really. But when people then say, where can I go and see, we want to know what that looks like, and they're very keen to pursue that, and we can facilitate that through ourselves.
Thank you. Just one more, and David, I'll give you one thing in terms of consistency, in terms of department speak. But I was nearly coming to the conclusion that you don't really need a science. It doesn't really matter if you have a science qualification or there's good high quality professional development there at all. It's just about putting things in context. But and maybe you're keeping one eye on Trevor Connolly, who was here earlier, and so on. And I understand you'd have to do that. But do you not see that there really is a correlation between the small percentage of our primary school teachers that have a science qualification and the lack of high quality continuing professional development in science? Do you not see there's a correlation between that and building that confidence in science?
I think there would be greater confidence if there were more science graduates or specialists within the primary school staff rooms. There would be more confidence. But I don't think you have to have that in order to have the confidence, if you see what I mean. I think one of the reasons that there is a relatively low confidence in delivering scientific teaching in science is because there aren't so very many science specialists. But there is a really important message. You don't have to have that many science specialists in order for a good teacher to deliver good teaching. Now, having said that, I don't think we should take the eye off the ball of encouraging young people who have a real scientific interest from considering primary school teaching. It's not an unreasonable path to take. Now, some of your colleagues may think, well, actually, if they're really interested in science, they should go on to higher education, get a degree and go into a high-level scientific employment. Well, please, not all of them. Some of them should be teaching in primary school, and that would make a difference too.
Okay.
I think as well, our initial teacher ed structures are also trying to address this issue. I mean, the likes of Stranmillis, Chair, you mentioned the Stranmillis project. I mean, that is innovative and it is an influence in practice, and it is ensuring that teachers are gaining confidence within the world around us. But you do see then the ripples of that kind of work, where teachers then, I'm thinking of schools within my district, which would be West Belfast, where those schools are then sharing that information with schools close by, and looking then at joint planning and looking at some team teaching across schools. So there's some lovely work going on to ensure the maximum.
Nicola, with that, I'm not asking a comment because I appreciate time's moving on in relation to that. I mean, I suppose it's, to use the analogy on it, I suppose it's moving from a situation where we're observing and applauding ripples to help sort of create them and encourage them. Yeah. Nelson, I think you're next.
Yeah, thank you. Could I ask Dr. Gurk, there, in your presentation at the start there, you said about learning and you used the phrase "in a familiar context," which struck me. What do you mean by that?
Well, again, my colleagues will elaborate, but it says primary schools are set very much in their locality, and within the locality you have specific aspects of history, geography or science, in fact, that are relevant to that community. And it's not bypassing those opportunities, it's using them to be the focus of the project work or the thematic work that you're going to do. And no matter where a school is located, even in a particularly rural area, there will be examples of locally relevant activities that can be undertaken as part of the World Around Us study. And they have real community involvement. The children then can go home and talk to their parents and their grandparents about it, and it sort of grounds it in the community. Would you say that's right, Fiona?
Well, the context then is all the more real for the child. I mean, it would be awful, and I lived for many years in East Belfast and taught the youngsters all about the Titanic, and it would be a crying shame if you didn't. And within that, there is very rich work in history, geography, science. It is just brimming with all three contributory strands. So it is about teachers grabbing and making use of what's on their doorstep. During the survey, for example, I was very disappointed to go to a particular school, and I arrived, I'll not tell you where it was, I thought, oh, there's this. There were so many resources that would have formed wonderful teaching and learning. And when I went in, they were doing something about Victorian medicine, and they were doing something about Vikings, and they were doing something about the South Pole. And while they're all laudable and interesting and meaningful topics, none of them actually linked to the here and now for the children. And that's really what we hope to see in the best practice, where teachers can make those links with and for the children, so that it is very real for them. And again, in the best practice, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the context and the connections and the connected learning.
Okay. I welcome that, because I think that all subjects should be embedded in the culture, the history, the geography of the area, and it certainly adds to that. It's an issue maybe for another day. Could I just ask, David, there, you mentioned that the department could commission CCEA to produce materials, but DE would then have to fund them, if I took you up right.
Yes, I mean, CCA is funded and it has a certain work programme. I think if we were to add a particularly substantial piece of work to their work programme, then we'd need to work out how that would be managed.
On what basis, or on what would be the process to get DE to actually commission? What leads you to the decision that you will commission something?
I think we need to consider the level of need, what is also available elsewhere. Those would be the main considerations. And
could you just, in the past, say, 12 months, have you commissioned CCEA to produce any new materials?
I'm going to have to put off the top of my head. I'd have to come back to you on the specifics.
That's fair.
Okay, Robin.
Thank you, Chair. Thank the members for calling, for being with us today. And thank you for the report as well. Very simple question, Chair. Could I ask the Department to outline the top 3 actions to deliver an improvement in science teaching, and how are you going to deliver those?
Well, I think I mean, going back to the points made at the very outset, the first action, in a way, has been taken, which is a report which draws attention to the issues that are faced in ensuring that there is good teaching and learning in the primary schools in this area. The dissemination of the learning from that report, the identification of more good examples, and the dissemination of good practice that is already going on, I think that is the top line of action to support improvement. I think flowing from the report, the key issue at school level is for the leadership of the school, the principal, the governors, to look at how they are planning for this area of the curriculum for their school. Whether they are needing additional resource that they don't have in the school, whether they need to give additional support to maybe a specialist that they have in the school already, whether they need to look for examples of seeing it being done in neighbouring schools, or whatever it is. I think that is the next key element. I think if there is a gap in the centrally provided resource, then that would also be a key part of it, and that's something that we take very seriously to evaluate.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Chris, finally.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, and apologies I missed the start of your presentation, but a lot of the questions have already been asked that I wanted perhaps answers to, such maybe just a couple of points. I really do welcome the whole move away perhaps from the traditional notion of science and this, the world around us, and trying to make it, emphasise its place in everyday life. I think that without a doubt it's the way to go. I was recently speaking to some of the guys from McLaren Mercedes from Formula 1, and they used Jensen Button a number of years ago to really reinforce kids that it's not science per se. There's in so many fun ways, sport in particular, the applied side of it. So I get where the direction's going. I get that. I really do welcome it. I wonder, can we do more in that? I don't think anybody sitting around this table is going to inspire young people. I don't think the department.
Speak for yourself.
I don't think the department are going to inspire. You may be lucky to get one or two teachers who are very inspiring, but I think we do need to harness the role of our local sporting heroes, be it Rory McIlroy or anybody else, who use science on a day and daily basis in a way that our kids might think is actually fun as well. For a couple of years now, the committee, we've been down to the BT Young Scientist exhibition. Fantastic. And it has to say it's very disappointing that we are not getting out of that what we should. And the number of schools is not good enough. And even the schools that do go down do very, very well. And again, I can't help but think the teachers who go along would be inspired massively and would really help. So I think we need to do more on getting in role models to really help inspire. And whatever way it is, I'm not sure. I think we need to do more on the BT Young Scientist. And I think we really need to see more for local schools in that. And then just the final point really is around gender. We hear different anecdotal things, girls aren't doing the sciences enough, we need to see more girls. Then you hear some people saying actually it's on the rise.
It is.
Where's the true picture? Is gender an issue still? Is it something that we can do to address it? And that's, I know it's a bit of a ramble, but
maybe if I just start off, and then my colleagues will come in on the gender point and the other point that you made. But in terms of getting involvement of high-profile individuals in promoting science, we noticed that 93% of the schools that responded to the survey actually had visits or had visitors into their schools, and I think those are really important focal points for the school, and it raises the profile and the energy and the enthusiasm. And I don't doubt that having those celebrities, if you like, involved is very useful, but you can't have that all of the time. There has to be the sort of day-to-day continuum. And I think having the teachers enthusiastic and confident in delivering on a daily basis, using the local environment for their thematic topics, and involving parents who have particular skills is a way of keeping that going on a day-to-day basis. But there's no doubt that bringing those people in injects an element of enthusiasm into it, but it just can't be there all of the time. I know Fiona wanted to come in on the gender point, because that's, I think, an important point.
Well, certainly in primary schools we would see no shortage of girls who are equally excited about science learning than boys. So we have to harness that and keep it going. And certainly in post-primary perspective, Nicola would be better placed to comment than myself. But
well, at both GCSE and A-level, across all STEM subjects, it would be about an even spread in terms of gender. However, there would be discrepancies in individual subject areas. For example, the likes of biology and chemistry would be around the 60% girls studying, so those subjects would have more girls studying the subject than boys. But the likes of physics, which is my subject area, there's about 30% girls studying
Is
physics.
there any evidence on final destination? Take politics, for example.
Yeah.
I used to tutor politics at university, and in my class there was more young women than men.
Yes.
3 of them young students went on to actually get involved in elected students, all men. So there was still, even though there was more, the final destination still tilted.
Absolutely,
Is that the same,
the tilt would be there as well. I mean, key here is that for some reason boys aspire to to higher elements of it, but I think that that's more than just education. However, education has a really crucial role to play in ensuring that girls have high expectations, because when they do take on physics as an A-level subject, they do exceptionally well.
Yeah.
You know, they outperform boys to a certain degree. You know, where it's around the 83% I start to see for girls and around the 78% for boys. So as a past physics A-level teacher, I was very keen to ensure that the girls kept their eyes open, that there's extremely lucrative and inspirational jobs out there for girls in physics. So keen to market them.
Yes, I'm picking up a couple of points. Firstly, on the gender point, yes, I think those points have been covered. And I think it comes back to actually a connected issue, which is connecting what is being learnt in school with what happens after education. This is probably anecdotal, may not be very scientific, but the story is that many girls in school have an aspiration to make a difference in the world, make things better. So the fact that a job is well paid may not be the reason that they're heading down a particular pathway. They want to do something that will make a difference. Where we are in the world now, the economy the way it is, and industries the way they are, actually having a good solid background in STEM subjects means that you can make a contribution to making the world a better place. And so that is an important part of the message. It's making the connection between what is being learnt and destination after education. And that's very important. That then connects to the importance of employers engaging with education. I think we see a real appetite from employers to engage more in education. And I think what we're now seeing even more is employers wanting to engage earlier and earlier in education. We do have structures and systems and ways in which employers can go involved in schools, but they tend to focus on post-primary schools. The fact that primary school is important too. So yes, celebrities who make science exciting, that may actually be the managing director of the firm down the road that's making something really interesting. That's a big enough celebrity for some primary schools, and that may make the difference. And actually making that connection between what's being done in school and what goes on outside the school is absolutely critical. Finally, on BT Young Scientists, obviously BT Young Scientists competition is for post-primary schools, and then beside it is the primary school fair. The examples of what I've seen in that primary school fair, they are wonderful, wonderful examples of doing it brilliantly. And I'm thinking of one example just this past year, a project about bridges. It was about bridges. It was about the geography of bridges, the history of bridges, the science of bridges, the physics of bridges, the engineering of bridges. It was terrific. And the lead there was not a scientist. She was a really, really good primary school teacher. And that really illustrated it, but it also illustrated to the other teachers who were coming saying, well, that's really interesting. They've done a great project, well, I could do something like that. And you then get a group of, say, P6, P7 kids who are down in Dublin for the day, seeing what's going on in the big room next door. And that, too, is a really inspiring opportunity.
Just one final point. I've always noticed that if they take a scholarship, for example, it's always available later in life because it's very often financial or whatever it may be. Is there any scope to look at what we can do earlier and like maybe using local business to say, look, you know, maybe it's in, you know, a 6-week intern during the summer or something, because I think very often hands-on, you talk about the awe and wonder, Fiona, sometimes that comes from it. You know, we have, you know, be it Hans Sloane, William Bell, whatever it may be, we have them here, but we don't use that whole role model thing so well. I can't imagine that you know, we should be doing something like that at an earlier stage for our kids to say, look, you know, if you do well, there's scholarship opportunities to maybe spend 2 or 3 weeks in the summertime in a local, you know, industry or wherever it may be, to help inspire that. I don't know if it's something that's able to do. I know when you're dealing with younger pupils, it's more difficult than it is with older students, but
I think, I mean, really where that would kind of already happen is around the work experience that goes on in post-primary schools. I think, and this picks up the points that Mr. Craig was making earlier about the connection between employers, education, and parents and the wider community. I think a lot of the work that's coming out of the review of the career strategy between DE and DEL, the opportunity to get the main stakeholders around, both at a system level, but also to encourage that getting together of the main stakeholders locally, is one of the sort of top of the list of priorities coming out of that work.
Okay, thank you
very much.
Thank you for your time today, for the information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, folks. Just in terms of follow-up action in relation to this, I think it is important. It's an ongoing subject on it, but I suppose we had concerns raised last week that essentially these things periodically were almost noted and then we seemed to move on. Possibly 2 or 3 courses of action. I'll bring you in a minute, John. One, obviously I think we need to get a formal response from the Department to the recommendations in the report. I think it would also be helpful if the press department there's a lot of useful language, but I suppose a limited amount in terms of, I suppose, direct commitments and that. I mean, I think if we need to press the department to produce a formal action plan arising out of this would be important. And I know which it may have to await that emerging. I know informally, I think the committee had previously agreed to look at a position paper on that. Now, I think it might be useful to get the information back from the department first. But if members are happy with those as a course of action, Jonathan, do you want in and then Robin?
Yep, no, Chair. I think that's a very, very good suggestion, because the thought did occur to me. You know, when you look at the date of the report, it's practically 6 months out of date anyway. So
it could be 18 months out of date.
It could be.
2014.
It could be. Noel has clearly bought into the concept of sharing good practice around. But if it's been, you know, if this report's been out there for the past 6 months to a year, what has she actually done to make sure that that's actually happening? And her role in the inspectorate has a key part to play in that. So, you know, what is the action plan? You're absolutely right in this, Chair. What are they actually going to do? You know, and it was great to hear that they have a science group there that can give advice. But I can tell you now, practically no schools out there know anything about it.
Robin?
It's very much along the same line, Chair, and I wanted to specifically ask them what they had done. And if you think about the 3 things they said, well, we produced a report, we're now going to disseminate the report. I'd like to know how they are going to disseminate the report. They indicated that there is a need for leadership within the schools. So what specifically have they done to address that lack of leadership within the schools, and how are they encouraging that and supporting it? And then the third one they mentioned was materials. Well, let's hear exactly what materials they have produced, commissioned, or at what stage they're being developed. It is this word that you've used, Chair, the outcomes, the actions of what's happening.
Okay, members, if we're happy to do that. Chris, do you want?
Just to include, I think we should include that we're now, 6 months from the next BT Young Scientist. What are they doing to make sure that there's increased numbers? You know, we should see an increase year on year on year on year. And it's not going to come if they do nothing. They have to actively do something about it. So,
Members all agreed with that. Members, just before the next presentation, I would suggest maybe take a 2 or 3 minute comfort break. I don't want to be really sort of engaging in a particular scientific experiment, but in relation to that, so if we'll resume in 2 or 3 minutes.
Siesta. Too much information.
Dangerous. Siesta.
Members, just obviously before the group arrives in, again, just to remind you in terms of your paper, running a little bit late, but there's a cover note at page 242 of your paper, and also then the submission that's been provided by Children with Disabilities Strategic Alliance. And I would welcome, I know a number of familiar faces here, but Can I welcome Alan Sheeran, the Director of the National Deaf Children's Society, Rachel Hogan, the Senate Representative of the Children's Law Centre, Heather Larkin, who's the Education and Policy Officer of the Special Education Needs Advice Centre, and Catherine Stevenson, who's the Head of the Legal Service at the Children's Law Centre. Maybe in terms of the legislation, if you maybe make an opening statement, maybe about 10 minutes maximum. We're running a little bit late, but we're keen obviously to hear your evidence.
No problem at all. As I said, I'm Alan Sheeran from National Deaf Children's Society, and we are collectively here representing the Children with a Disability Strategic Alliance. We very much welcome the opportunity to present to the committee. The SEN review is something we've been working on for quite some time. To say first that CDSA brings together around 33 organisations from across the children's sector and the disability sector. It's co-chaired by Children in Northern Ireland and by Disability Action. And essentially, we want to ensure that policy impacting on the lives of disabled children is informed by the children's rights, needs and circumstances. To look at the background to today, the SEN review was commenced in 2006. Proposals were produced in 2009. CDSA commented on the proposals and supported the Education Committee's consultation with parents in the Great Hall back some years ago. In the intervening period then, CDSA produced an education manifesto which suggested changes to the original proposals, and thereafter we eventually arrived at a memorandum was presented by the Minister. Following increased concern at the implementation of the existing SEN system, CDSA produced the State of SEN Statements, which was just over a year ago, which was looking at problems within the existing system. I have to say that we're a bit concerned about the length of time this process has taken. Children entering P1 in 2006, whenever the process started, are now heading towards their 14+ transition meetings in the next year. And I suppose that we need to think that the children that we're actually working for are constantly moving up through the system, and we really do need to get this system up and running as soon as possible. That being said, I have a number of points here, and then I'll pass on to our other colleagues here. CDSA is concerned that we do work towards outcomes for children with SEN, and we would welcome the fact that this is moving towards that. Children should be at the centre of SEN, and CDSA welcome the new focus on learning and outcomes. The importance of outcomes-based accountability has been recognised by the Children and Young People Strategic Partnership, and cross-agency training on outcomes-based accountability has already been initiated across a whole range of different organisations, and we think that this fits in very well with that. CDSA would hope to see an increase in the accountability of schools and education providers to young people with disabilities and their parents. CDSA would also be concerned that there should be some kind of a review of assessments of the needs of children with disabilities. Currently, assessments of children's needs are problematic. We need to strengthen the influence of expert assessment within the SEN system, which should be very much part of this. We need to look at the appropriateness of assessments. For instance, at the minute there are 23 assessments for deaf children, but in fact in the majority of cases there's only one assessment actually being used, so we need to look at the appropriateness of that. There's also very limited understanding of the impact of assessment across education, but also across within health as well. For instance, NDCS has been doing training with social work staff who are asked to provide assessments for statements and so forth, and a lot of the social workers were not aware of the impact that their assessments would have. I now hand over to, I think, Heather.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I just want to make some comment about the personal learning plans, which is in under clause 3 of the bill. The personal learning plans, they will replace the current individual education plans. And under the bill, I mean every child with special education needs, whether they have a statement of SEN or not, will be entitled to have a PLP, personal learning plan. While certainly we certainly welcome the reference to the personal learning plans within the bill, because there's a very important aspect to personal learning plans, and that's the need again to focus on outcomes, and also the need for the regular review of personal learning plans to make sure really that children's progress is monitored very consistently and very regularly. The information on the format and the content and the review of the PLPs will be contained within the Code of Practice when it comes. So really at this stage, any really informed assessment of the PLP is really difficult at this stage without seeing the Code of Practice. But what is very important is that the personal learning plan is an opportunity to provide a statutory safeguard for those children whose progress and educational provision is dependent solely on their PLP. That would be the 74,000 children saying who don't, the number of those who don't have statements. So the personal learning plan is very important for them in terms of their progress, their educational progress and the provision that they're receiving. One of the things that would concern us would be in relation to Clause 3, that there could perhaps be some consideration given to some sort of a time frame around the personal learning plan, certainly in respect of review of the personal learning plan, whether that be termly or something that might be explored in respect of that, and also how long a child stays on a particular level, which will be the new levels of support within the new framework, that the personal learning plan will be reviewed to ensure that they're actually on the appropriate level according to their need. That means that really with that sort of statutory safeguard that those children their progress is going to be very regularly and certainly very importantly consistently reviewed and monitored. One of the most common concerns that we hear as advice agencies has been around the quality of the current individual education plans, and certainly that was recognised within the consultation, and which is why this has come forward in terms of the personal learning plans to try and improve that situation. One of the other concerns that we hear from the parents and families who come to us is the lack of independent redress when they're dissatisfied or they're concerned about progress and provision of the children and young people. And I think any change to the framework must explore further how this situation can be improved, particularly in relation to the PLPs. For example, there might be exploration around the role of the inspectorate to focus on the PLPs. Also, what form maybe of access to independent redress. DARS, which is Dispute Avoidance and Resolution Service, it's really uncertain as to whether or not they would have a relevant role around that, whether that would have the impact that's required. There also, I think, needs to be greater input into the PLPs from others who are involved with the children and the young people, that be the educational psychologists, specialist teachers, obviously the children and young people themselves, and also any support services, that they all work together to produce a good, effective personal learning plan. And obviously consideration around some sort of statutory duty to review and monitor the personal learning plans, maybe within Clause 3. And just to finish off by saying the personal learning plan really does play a very key part in evidencing progress, and that's to identify the need for any further assessment that's needed and any further educational provision that's needed, as well as the outcomes and the progress. And it's also particularly important whenever you come to review a statement of special educational needs, that the personal learning plan provides you with that evidence of how that statement's being effective.
Thank you. I'm Rachel Hogan from Children's Law Centre, and I'm here to speak on behalf of CDSA in relation to those children who do have the statutory protection of a statement under Articles 15 and 16 of the 1996 Education Order. And to make clear the difference between those children with statements and those without. Children with statements comprise approximately 16,000 children. As well as there being problems for children without statutory protection, we also have problems for these children who do have statements, and we'd like the SEN review and the outworkings of that to address those problems. Just to be clear, that a statement itself is a legal document which affords legal protection to children with special educational needs and disability. And the way that that document is drafted and set out is absolutely critical to the enforceability of provision for those children. And particularly in the times that we're in at the moment, where budgets are very tight, it's important to make sure that a statement is properly written and is properly enforceable by the parent and possibly by the child. There are two concerns that we have about statemented children as an umbrella organisation for all those children with disabilities, and that is the access thresholds for children to receive a statement are not known. Those will be under the Code of Practice. So we don't know how many children will actually have a statement, or whether there will be a reduction in the numbers with statements. And the second issue, which comes up time and time again in all of our practice, is the enforceability of the statement. What is in it? How is it written? We currently don't know what format a CSP is going to take. All that we do know is that it's proposed under Article 16.2 of the 1996 order to use an amending power to bring in the CSP in the regulations. So what we would ask the committee to look at is what is actually in the regulations in relation to the form and content of the CSP. That should be subject to scrutiny to ensure that both the inputs, the provisions going into the statement, and the outputs, that is the result of that provision that is put in, are measurable. In other words, that there are smart targets, if you like. So who gets a statement and what do they look like? At the moment, a statement has 6 parts, and the parts that we were concerned with is Part 2, special educational needs of the child, and Part 3, the provision to meet those special educational needs. To make a statement enforceable, it has to be specific. So specific and quantified provision is lawful provision, and specific quantified provision is enforceable provision. Our Education Authority at the moment is engaged in a practice of drafting statements that our members see very regularly, which are vague and therefore virtually unenforceable. So to give you an example, instead of a child having 25 hours of one-to-one adult assistance in their statement, and the parent can see what that is and be consulted about it when the statement is being drafted, it might say, John will have access to a level of adult assistance determined by the board at a future date. So the statement is not specific. Now, the legal framework itself does say in Article 16 that the statement should specify the provision, and we feel that the Education Authority should be brought to the committee to account for the fact that statements are not being drafted in accordance with that legislation, Article 16. The regulations also state that in the format of a statement in Part 3, here specify the provision to be made to meet the special educational needs of the child. So vague and woolly statements are not meeting that requirement that's already in the regulations. What we would ask the committee to consider is whether it should be clarified within the regulations that specification also includes quantification. And this is a phrase that's used by practitioners frequently, specification and quantification in statements. Now, I think on an interpretation of the word specific, you would expect it to be quantified. But because that's not happening, we'd like the committee to look at maybe whether the word quantified should be inserted into Article 16 or into the form of the statement under the regulations in Schedule 1. There is a duty to consult parents when a statement is being drafted. If it's not clear on the statement what the child is being offered, how can a parent possibly be lawfully consulted? And we have been successful in challenging such a case in LC's application, which the committee has. So specific and quantified provision is lawful and it is enforceable, and that's what CDSA is seeking to achieve by coming to the committee today. Just briefly mention as well that the legal definition of special educational provision includes both education provision and health provision. There's no doubt about that, and it's established both in statute and in case law that interprets the statute. We have difficulty with Article 14 of the 96 order in that there's not a mandatory duty on health to cooperate with education. There's merely a qualified duty which is subject to resources. The committee has access to a link to one of our cases where a young person speaks about her experience. It's on the homepage of the Children's Law Centre's website, and that is Carla's case. And Carla was unable to get physiotherapy in a mainstream school. She has cerebral palsy and was being asked to sit in her wheelchair all day, every day, becoming stiff and sore and uncomfortable, when all she needed was some physiotherapy to loosen up her muscles. We had a 2-year battle, 2 tribunals, a disability discrimination case, and almost had to go to JR to get that young girl health provision in a mainstream grammar school. And we think that that shouldn't be the case. So we call on the committee to look to strengthening the duty upon health, perhaps by engaging with colleagues in health.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. And we've got obviously a very detailed submission here in relation. I want to maybe move on to some questions just in relation to this. Unless there's something briefly, Catherine?
There was a short. Could I give you a short briefing? Just
very. I mean, I'm just conscious of the fact we were looking really for about 10 minutes, and we've gone well above that, and we're running a little bit late. So maybe you could just. But some of these things will come out in questions as well.
There's a couple of asks. Maybe I was coming from the perspective more of the general resourcing issue. I mean, the committee will be well briefed in terms of the the challenges coming up with resources, in that there's been such a huge increase in the number of children being diagnosed with SEN. I won't labour that other than to say that there's been an increase from 16 to 22% of the whole school population over the last 10 years. You have the coupling of this growth in demand and obviously the impact on the budget. So in that context, and with reference to what Rachel was saying about the interface between education and health, we would say CDSA would ask for the committee to consider looking at the introduction of time-based targets for provision of health advices within the SEND regulations when you're looking at statutory assessments, and we'd also strongly support the introduction of a statutory duty to cooperate across the government departments, and that would include health and education and pooling resources with that. In terms of the second point I was going to make, and I will make it very briefly, was about CDSA would like to call for a unified systematic approach to allocation of SEN resources by the Education Authority. There is really a need for greater transparency in relation to allocation of resources and policies and threshold criteria that are being used for allocation of those finite resources, and we would recommend that Clause 2 be amended somewhat to include an additional statutory requirement to publish all resource allocation guidance and threshold criteria. And in times of deepening austerity, it will become even more incumbent on the Education Authority and schools to ensure that fair and lawful decisions are taken in relation to the allocation of those finite resources. We would ask also, in terms of review of those policies, that the SEND bill could be amended to introduce a clause extending the existing statutory requirement on education boards under Article 6 of the 96 Order to determine and keep under review policy, and we would ask for an extension of that to include all resource allocation processes that are coming through with the new EA. So it would be an extension, not just policy, but those guidance and allocation criteria, so that we can see, obviously with the new Education Authority coming into play, we'll have a harmonisation of policy, and it's incumbent then to ensure that when we have a harmonisation of policy, that those policies are fair and are legally compliant. And the final point I wanted to make was in relation to the role of the ETI and improved inspections and quality assurance of SEN provision, and we would see quite a good role for the ETI in that, to monitor and review pupil performance, and to do that at Education Authority level but also at school level, and that could be linked in with reviews of PLPs and the annual review process, and also it could assist with better utilisation of finite resources if you would look at models of education that would be the most effective, cost effective.
Okay.
So that's all I wanted.
First of all, thank you for both the oral evidence you've given, and also I know you've given us in terms of paper detailed submission. Obviously those will be, as we work through the issues, we get to a later stage where we're looking at each of the clauses. Obviously issues as you raise will be areas that we'll be examining. I want to just ask you a few questions, just a couple of specific issues, but I suppose first of all the more general level. I mean, one of the issues which I'm sure are a certain level of constraint on yourselves in terms of submission, and also a certain constraint on us, is the nature of this. And I think, to be fair, and it's not unreasonable, the approach that's taken on it, is that the legislation itself is pitched at a certain high level, but it's proportionately the level of work that will be there in regulations and the code of practice, I suppose, compared to most pieces of legislation, it'll be very heavily weighted in that direction. Now, obviously, as a committee, we've raised the issue of a need to have a degree of indication from the department as to what is intended in the regulations, because we don't want to sign off effectively on a blank cheque in relation to it. One area that's been raised with us by way of legislative advice that we've got independently is potential high-level constraints that can be put on the legislation. I appreciate you've touched on some of these already in terms of the regulatory making powers. And I just wondered if there's any particular thoughts you have on that, first of all. And I suppose then, secondly, I can also deal with this strand of things in terms of the code of practice, which will obviously be even then a level below the regulations, but will obviously be important. Do you have any thoughts in terms of additional safeguards within that, in terms of assembly procedure? So perhaps looking at formal agreement from the Assembly to any code of practice before it's implemented, rather than simply being potentially produced by the department and So if you could maybe just deal with those couple of points first of all, and then a couple of other specific issues just to wonder.
I'll invite my colleagues to come in as and when. We obviously have issues about not actually seeing regulations or code of practice, because that's the heart of really of SEN. I think the last time, I think it took 2 years for the code of practice to come out. There'd be real concerns that we shouldn't take that long to get there this time. We'd actually like to see them running in parallel. We are aware that the department are currently working on them. Would have concerns because of we're going to see secondary legislation and then code of practice coming in as guidance. That really there's very limited means to change anything that comes down from the department. For that reason, we'd be very interested in seeing some kind of a co-design process developed whereby the department can actually sit down with people within the sector, whether that's teachers' unions, other representatives, CDSA and others, and actually sit down and design that process through as it is now. Probably involve yourselves or whatever in that. So there's real concerns over that, and real concerns that we may end up with something which we can't see from this current time.
Understand that. Okay. Can I ask you just sorry, unless you would add only 3 items of detail, but I'll just perhaps detail maybe is the wrong way to put it, but specific issues. But I'll maybe just give you the sort of the 3 issues together. First of all, obviously, in terms of, you've raised concerns in terms of Clause 5 with the time limits side of it, but specifically, and it does seem, looking at the bill, that there's specific time limits put on as regards parents, but they don't, leaving aside the merits of that in terms of truncating. I think everyone can agree at one level that I think one of the concerns is that the slowness of the process, that parents quite often are looking to get help, and then actually it's such a laborious and lengthy process that, people are looking to see if that can move quicker. But it does seem that the one constraint is put on, from a time limit, but a reduction in the legislation is put on parents. But there doesn't appear to be any particular level of statutory time limits put on other advice givers and the department. So I'll just ask for your views on that. Secondly, and I suppose it comes back probably to the very initial point that Alan made in terms of the need for outcomes and tangible measurements of outcomes, and just wonder if you can give us some thoughts on how you see the department being, what would be your advice on the best way that outcomes can be measured? Because one thing even simply to say outcomes, if outcomes emerge without any level of measurement. And the final point just I want to raise in terms of your evidence on it was, you've raised issues about retaining SEND funding centrally, but in terms of, it seems a lot of people would see best practice, the funding should be delegated as close to the schools as possible, so to allow those individual decisions, and maybe just suggestion of why schools shouldn't be more directly accountable and responsible for SEND funds rather than being quite sort of centrally driven. So if you maybe deal with those 3 points, then
I'll take the first issue.
Okay.
In terms of the time frame. Certainly, we would CDSA would welcome a reduction in time frame for those parents and families who are waiting for their children to be assessed. We were concerned about time frame for parents being limited in those circumstances where parents need to seek additional help and support. But also, we would recommend that in circumstances where parents have got their advices in a very timely way, that things should skip forward and we shouldn't be waiting for the 22 or 29 days for the statutory assessment process to gain momentum and move forward. And then the other thing, and I know the department has given statistics that in 81% of cases where there is a delay in a statutory assessment going through, it is due to the fact that there's been a delay in health advice that's coming back. So there is a really major concern there in terms of the health timeframes being honed down and possibly time-based targets being placed within the regulations or within, I know it would be difficult within legislation obviously, but within the regulations that there would be very clear time-based targets to be met, and to, I suppose, incentivise health professionals to feed into the statutory assessment. I mean, they are under pressure in making their other commitments to patients within the community, within the health service. So it is to try and to make that make that join and get things moving quicker, really. And we'd also, as I say, we've already mentioned the statutory duty to cooperate. That might be another way of addressing that issue.
Could I perhaps add another aspect to that point? Many of the cases that we deal with, and cases that I'm dealing with at the moment in my work as SENDIS representative, it's not actually the statutory time frame itself that is the difficulty. Even though 26 weeks can seem like a long time, if that is adhered to, that's not necessarily the difficulty in itself. The problem is that parents or schools are requesting a statutory assessment and being refused, many times in circumstances when the statutory assessment should proceed. There are blockages to statutory assessment caused by lack of educational psychology, slots being available to school, and the use of a time allocation system. I have a case at the minute, for example, where a parent asked for a statutory assessment a year ago when her child was about to start primary 1, and the board refused that in circumstances where I would have said they should have allowed it, and that has delayed the process by at least 6 months. We've now got a statutory assessment, and now we start the 26-week time frame. So the majority of delays in the cases that I deal with, I would say, are to do with blockages to getting the statutory assessment.
I'm just going then to speak in relation to outcomes and measurements, which you mentioned as well. The core of, I suppose, all teaching is to do about progress and achieving progress with children, and it should be the same for all children with disabilities. And certainly we believe that whenever you're producing an IEP or you're producing a statement or whatever, that begins as almost a guess as to what's going to be best for this child, and it's only after you're on your review that you can actually look and decide whether the progress has been achieved or not. And that's the very key role of the classroom teacher and any other specialist teachers that may come into that. What we would be suggesting is that those teachers would set smart, measurable outcomes, whatever, throughout the year, for the next year for that child, and then that they are considered at the end of the year, so that the annual review really does become a review of the child's progress. If the child isn't progressing, then we need to look at what needs to be done to improve that for the child over the next year. I think all of us have examples where children have almost been left to drift, and really that can't happen. And what we would like to see within this is that we focus on outcomes, and that this becomes outcome driven, and that really the SEN process constantly moves forward towards that. We don't think that it would be too difficult to achieve that. We think that there needs to be a process put in. So that was one of the reasons we had issues about the diminution of the annual review, because the annual review really is the only time during the year whenever the parent has a sit down with the child and with the school to talk about where the child is going to. So we would be very, very much enthusiastic about a change towards outcomes-based accountability within this.
Could I again perhaps add to that point? We don't yet know what the form of a CSP is in terms of statemented children and their outcomes, and I would call on the department to let us have a copy of what a CSP is to look like, because my understanding is that there's to be an additional box added to that statement with outcomes being the topic. And there would need to be some sort of framework, I think, developed as to how to measure inputs and outcomes. We measure inputs by saying what they are on the statement, and being specific about them. Measuring outcomes is going to vary in each individual case, but there would have to be some sort of guidance or framework to enable teachers, for example, to know and to report back on whether the child is meeting those outcomes, maybe through the annual review process.
Can I just make a wee point as well about, you mentioned about delay, and just in respect of the regulations, that the current regulations have the information guidance in them to do with the advices which are brought from health and brought from education. The education psychologist effectively reports and advices to inform the authority staff to draft up the statement. So basically all that information comes through the statutory assessment. But in terms of delay, sometimes you find that the particularly the educational advices, they don't actually give any real kind of substance in terms of what level of support the child might need. So those are the practitioners in schools who have an idea of how much support the child might need, whether that be additional learning support or classroom assistance support. But that will not come through clearly enough in the draft statement, and Rachel alluded to that earlier about the lack of specification. But there's also a delay around that, because then what happens is that once you have all those advices and the draft statements being drawn up, when the parent then names the school that the child is going to go to, and most often it's the school they're attending, you then have a delay where the board have to go back, or the authority have to go back to the school and discuss how many hours or what level of support might be needed. And it seems it'd be much faster to actually have that in the educational advice and the educational psychology advice, a more clear idea, so that there isn't this further delay when a draft statement comes out. Within 15 days you can turn that draft statement around. If it's clear and it's quantified and it's specified, there probably isn't a reason to delay any further. But there is an additional delay where they have to go back to the school, they agree with the school a number of hours, and then that's then taken to a panel within the education authorities. That's the way it's been happening. Whether or not there'll be a new practice, we're unsure. And that adds additional delay between the draft and final stage of the statement. So there's things like that in sort of the actual practical realities that perhaps maybe even in the regulations something could be explored around just maybe more specific information about what those advices should contain, just to give more information to inform the statement.
Okay. I think if there was an obligation within the statute or regulations to quantify properly on statements when the circumstances allow that, then there's less room for reporters not reporting on what the child should have. That should speed the process up.
And then just the final point then on the balance, if you like, between I suppose, decisions taken at central level and funding being delegated, type of thing.
In terms of that, CDSA would have concerns in relation to the duty. We welcome some of the provisions within Clause 3 around the duties of the Board of Governors to have PLPs and also to designate a learning support coordinator. But we are concerned that the duty upon Boards of Governors to make provision for children should be further strengthened, because obviously if monies are going to be put to schools, schools have to be fully accountable for how that money is spent. And at the moment, there's no formal mechanism for redress for parents in place if children's PLPs are not being delivered upon, if the provision is not being put in place. And with all the best will in the world, schools are in a position where they're reliant on their own capacity and their resources to make provision for children, and they are also waiting to identify further needs through the boards. So they can use their best endeavours, but it's difficult whenever parents wish to challenge whether those best endeavours are being made in effect.
We have a number of members of the committee. Sean, first of all.
Could I just make one further point on that? So I keep jumping on the back of all the questions, but I think it's important to make the committee aware that when Sir Robert Salisbury was doing the Common Funding Formula review, he noted within his review that it was not yet the time to delegate funds to schools, because schools do not have the systems and procedures in place to be accountable.
Well, I understand that. The only thing, Rachel, I would say is one of the common things I've got from a long time, and the comparison between Northern Ireland and almost anywhere else, is that proportionally so much is held at the centre and so little is directly in the hands of...
That's absolutely necessary in Northern Ireland at present, because schools are not properly accountable for that funding. They can spend the funding on, they don't have to spend it on special.
It's an issue we'll come back to, but I need to bring in Sean.
Also is the review, the built-in process for review of PLPs. Once that's honed down and we're able to monitor and progress the progress of children under PLPs, then schools can be properly held to account when you're looking at the measurable outcomes for children.
I have to say I sat on the LMS steering group, within the department a number of years ago. And whenever we were redesigning the whole LMS scheme, and the issue there is accountability. I mean, if there was some kind of accountability at the school level for funding specifically for SEN, there may be a way of doing this, but the problem is then that you would have schools that would have a lot of SEN underspend at the end of the year, and other schools who would simply not have sufficient for the year.
Obviously, an issue will need
Just
Sean.
one very, very quick point. When I listen to Rachel, the common thing coming out to me here is really, in terms of measuring outcomes, we need to have smart targets. And the other thing that's coming out, I think the big ask you're really asking is, particularly in terms of this PLPs and so on, and in terms of the code of practice, that really the fact that it's part of secondary legislation is problematic. I think possibly the ask is there any way, I don't know the logistics of this, whether the Assembly or the Education Committee can have greater scrutiny of this?
Yeah, I think, I suppose ultimately probably more of a comment, but it's obviously something that will need to be whenever we come to processing.
If you could scrutinise the regulations, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, that's I mean, look, I think one of the things that was said in terms of the issue is to try to see this as a hopefully a reasonably seamless process. I think the problem is that whenever you've got the high-level legislation coming up front, without really having a great deal of knowledge of the regulations, it kind of hampers the opportunity.
I mean, from my own background in terms of deaf children, one of the things that I want to absolutely ensure are within regulations is that their specialists should be directly involved in the writing of statements. That is in regulations, and I want to ensure. I mean, I've been assured that there's been no change on that, but it's still part of the overall regulations that we aren't aware of at the moment.
No, I mean, I think there's the issue around the lack of knowledge in that regard. I think the other thing, and where obviously there is a nervousness around this, is that obviously by definition, and you've mentioned obviously a number of areas where you would see changes to the amendments to that. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about primary legislation, that could be subject and tested in terms of each clause to amendment. I suppose the major problem is once you get to regulations, it then becomes either an accept or reject. And in many ways, because in whatever department it is, regulations can obviously quite often be doing a very good thing, but you may have elements of it that you don't particularly like in terms of detail. To then say no to that regulation can become a bit of a nuclear option, and it's something which I think committees have been, understandably, I think, very reluctant to do. It has happened occasionally, but it's relatively rare. Right, Robin, I know that you're in sort of, and you're. We need to head on to something else quickly.
Chair. Thank you. Thank the delegation for coming up, and partially, Chair, in a response to you, Alan answered a part of my concerns around the statement and the annual review of statements. But indeed, Heather was mentioning indeed the personal learning plans and the statutory obligation to review personal learning plans, and the connection then between the review of the statement and the personal learning plans.
Yeah.
How do you see that being addressed?
Well, I mean, obviously every child will have a personal learning plan, whether the statement or not, so it's important for progress for every child, but it's particularly important for those children's statements. So whenever you come to do an annual review of a statement, you're actually looking at whether or not that statement is still current and relevant for that child. Is the provision creating progress? Are they meeting the objectives on the statement? So for you to have a very comprehensive, monitored, well-monitored personal learning plan, or currently the individual education plans, is really important, because it allows you to actually sit down and say, right, have targets been met? The personal learning plan would almost be the working document for that statement in the classroom. So it's very hard to actually do a really effective annual review if there's a very poor record of progress in terms of any education plan. Also, at the minute, the education plans, maybe once every school year, they might be looked at and they might be reviewed. For some children, that's too long, because you have to make sure that the provision you're giving them is actually making a difference. So even if you're just checking, you're just monitoring to make sure everything's on target. So it's very inconsistent in terms, our experience would be in terms of the practice in schools. There's a lot of flexibility around individual education plans. There's a sort of a core content within the code of practice, certainly core elements that you would expect. But there's no real guidance on how long an education plan currently would be in place. I mean, you could have one maybe for 1 year, 2 years, targets repeated, not being achieved. And that means it's really just it's not being effective for the child. It's not a working education plan for them. It's not a strategy for them in terms of education. So I think to give some more guidance to schools, or to have something even within the primary legislation, would actually ensure that schools have to focus on a particular child, put the spotlight on a child and say, right, is this education plan, this personal learning plan, have we got it right? Are the strategies in place? Are we differentiating our teaching? Is everybody involved that we can involve in terms of support? And actually it then allows you to actually stay on target with the child, because you're, in some sense, you have a duty then, you have your legal duty then to make sure that you show you're actually reviewing and monitoring that personal learning plan. At the minute, the practice is very, very broad amongst the schools, certainly that we would have experience of, in terms of when they review it, how they review it, when they move a child forward to the next stage of provision. So I think, if there was something within the time frame around that, I think it would help.
Chair, very quick, would that actually change the status of the document, the personal learning plan?
A personal learning plan in itself is not protected by statute in the same way the statement is. A personal learning plan is, as you say, a working document that you use every day. Targets be used on a daily, weekly basis.
But to be wholly effective and require the statutory up, does that not need to?
There's no statutory time limit, for example, on how long you should operate a particular PLP for. So a child could be sitting on the same PLP for 2 years. And that's a difficulty.
Yeah. It's not an enforceable document like the statement. It hasn't, it hasn't been. You can't enforce a personal learning plan, but certainly what you would want to try and do is make sure that it is being reviewed consistently and regularly by all schools, so that every child who has special educational needs, that they have a good, effective education plan for their individual need, and it is being regularly reviewed. At the minute, it's there is no time frame given in terms of reviewing education plans. It's decided by the schools themselves.
Okay, Sandra's next.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for your presentation. I've a lot of good points raised today. I just wanted to focus on just something, Rachel, you'd mentioned earlier about blockages. Parents in schools are requesting assessments, but they're being refused. Maybe you could tell me a bit more about that, because I'm just thinking it just struck a thought from the back of my mind somewhere that parents are wanting their child statemented or assessed for statement, and there's only so many in a particular year, and it's so that they can reach targets, or so the department can reach targets, or the board can reach targets, or it's something that I'm not knowledgeable enough about, so that's why I'm asking about it. Is it, they're trying to reach all their targets, so you're not allowed to ask for so many more statements?
Yes, the difficulty really arises because a time allocation system has been imposed upon schools, and schools are told by the Education Authority, you have 4 slots, or whatever number they're allocated.
Right.
And if you have X number of children, you have to prioritise yourselves which child should be seen. So the school is left in the invidious position then, when a parent comes to ask for help, they have to decide whether John, Jack or James is going to get the help. And one of those children or more may have to wait till next term, next year, or the parent might be led to believe, well, my child's needs aren't as important as others, and nothing may happen. And what often isn't realised both by schools and by parents is that the parent has the right to go behind that process and request a statutory assessment, and therefore ask the board to make a determination about whether the child needs a statutory assessment, and that is outside that system. Right. But what very often happens is that the whole process is delayed if a board then refuses a statutory assessment. A parent can do 2 things when the statutory assessment is refused. They can fight it or they can accept it. And I would hazard a guess that many parents do just accept that decision. Those that do have the wherewithal will lodge an appeal to SENDIST, and then SENDIST will decide whether or not there should be a statutory assessment. I think it's worth mentioning that the legal bar or threshold that one needs to meet to get a statutory assessment is actually really low. It simply is under Article 15 of the 96 Order that a child probably has special educational needs and probably requires the board to determine the provision to meet those needs. It's actually a really low threshold. So if a parent can bring evidence of their concerns, and the school may also have concerns, many children should be reaching that threshold. But what has happened is that boards have developed, there's the Code of Practice has a set of criteria, and boards have developed the 5 board provisional criteria, or the Education Authority as it now is, which is 40 pages long. a whole set of other criteria outside this statutory framework, which is inhibiting access to those services. So there's layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy outside the system, and it's very, very difficult for parents to actually navigate that. And when they come to any of our organisations looking for advice, we'll help them through the process. But it's not happening automatically that when a child needs help to get it. Children are waiting for years.
I think when you have a legal framework, I think everything should be contained within that legal framework, as the SEND system is, as a separate support system within education. And I think when you have that legal framework, that you should try as best you can to make sure that everything you need to know about the framework and everything you need to do to make a decision on what support a child needs, whether that be in school or whether it be by the Education Authority, that guidance is there within your legal framework, rather than maybe having to then look to bring in additional practices or policies or whatever it might be to try and make it more manageable within resources or whatever might be the reason.
I think it's fair to say as well, it is all in the framework, but it's not been adhered to. Other criteria have been invented.
Can I make a few short points just on the back of that? We provided the committee before with the case of LC, which was around a statutory assessment request and a parent who had been refused the statutory assessment process, and the outcome on that judgment was that parental representation should be given proper consideration by the Education Authority. One of the other features in that case was that in many circumstances where statutory assessments were refused and parents filed appeals, they were conceded because actually there was no lawful ground for the board to refuse the statutory assessment. So in the first place, so we're seeing patterns where there's refusals, then when they're queried, gone to appeal, they're conceded, and really that would be evidence of situations where we're holding back the fort for children accessing statutory provision, and we're very concerned about that pattern. The other thing is also the point that I had made just at the beginning in relation to as Rachel's mentioned, the 5 board criteria. We see many resource allocation guidance models or resource allocation threshold criteria coming through within the 5 boards, and there's disparate policies. And what I was saying at the introduction was that there needs to be real transparency about that, that there needs to be, under Article 6 of the 96 order, if there's any review for arrangements for SEN allocation or SEN policy, that should be consulted upon. Now, what we're saying is all that guidance and all of those hidden policies around how the resources are allocated should also be on show, and parents should know what those criteria are, because what's happening in times of austerity, those things are not being put on the table. So it's very difficult for parents, and it's very difficult for anybody advocating on behalf of parents to weigh up whether in fact a child should access provision under those thresholds or under those policies. So it's about strengthening that responsibility to ensure that all of those things come within those.
But also indicate, whenever we, in terms of the process of the consideration stage or the committee stage that we're on, from the committee's point of view, I'm not, I suppose, making a commitment as to what's in and what won't be in addition to consideration in terms of a formal clause-by-clause side of things, and indeed any action taken. The committee would also, I suppose, has the potential also to make recommendations in terms of particular actions that can get taken, which may lie outside directly what is there in terms of legislation. That's obviously something we'll have to from all witnesses consider as well.
The opportunity now is because of the harmonisation of policies within the single education authority that there should be full transparency, there should be consultation, there should be Section 75 proofing, quality proofing as the impact of those policies on children, because children with SEN may also reach other, have other protections under Section 75 also.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and then finally, Jonathan.
Thanks, Chair. Rachel, I was listening to what you were saying about the length of time it was taking for a lot of parents to actually get the statement. Is a lot of that down to the lack of resources that there was within the existing boards? And I know one of the biggest issues with the whole child psychology and access to it, there was an interesting answer back to me when I asked about that question. They're trying to create now a regional unit, trying to do away with the postcode lottery. Is that something which you feel might help that situation? Because there seems to be a bottleneck there a
There's
real
an
bottleneck.
opportunity with the harmonisation of policies, as long as those policies are open to scrutiny. Our concern would be that it could be a mechanism to further restrict opportunities for parents and children. That's a real concern, and that's why we want an open and transparent process that stakeholders can engage in when regional policies are brought in, because the 5 board criteria that I've just referred to was a regional document, and it, for example, restricts access to the bottom 2% of performers, when in fact 5% of children have statements. I think it seems from the work that we all do in CDSA that the system is chronically under-resourced. Pressure on the system is growing because there are more children with special needs, and yet the budget has been cut for 5 years, and I think there's another 1% cut planned. So there's less money. It probably needs to be an injection of resources really to solve, the absolute distress and heartache that we see on a daily basis that parents and children are suffering is completely unconscionable and inhuman, and it needs to be addressed. And if that means looking at the resources and allocating them in a more fair way with a transparent process, well then that's a good process. But trying to keep running with what we have at the minute, to me, it would be both unlawful and immoral.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you for your evidence today, both in terms of what you've already submitted in the oral. I'll maybe make one final request to you, because I appreciate one thing probably was a little bit thrown at you, a little bit perhaps unfair on that. We mentioned in terms of the high-level constraints potentially in the legislation on the regulations on it now. I know that you responded to that question. If you have any further thoughts on that in terms of anything you want to submit to us in writing, it may be useful as well, because you maybe want to give a bit of consideration.
Appreciate the opportunity to do that. That's quite a difficult question.
No, I appreciate that, and to some extent we're all trying to sort of, pin the tail on possibly the invisible donkey at this stage in that regard. So I appreciate limitations, but any thoughts you have on that, I think, would be very helpful on that. And thank you very much for your evidence today.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Folks, if we move on then, obviously we'll be receiving further evidence submissions on
Chair, just next week, the committee is due to hear from the Education Authority and the Health and Social Care Boards. The committee's content for the part down tonight and mentioned some of the issues that were raised. Okay. The AD.
Okay. Thank you. Right. We've, I suppose, 2 other main items of business. Correspondence for you at tabs. There's 9 items at pages 271 to 298. Under correspondence, and there's 2 tabled items. So we deal first of all with the items that are in your pack. I suppose in terms of action points, at 8.4, we have a letter from a member of the Youth Parliament who's requesting to meet the chair, which I'm very happy to facilitate. But specifically also, and I'd be happy if we get something organised to make that available to any other members who want to come along, probably just in informal fashion. But he's also suggested, Mr McVitie, there's a campaign, Make Your Mark, the UK's largest youth consultation campaign, which falls within that side of it. He's suggested that we facilitate, I'll seek members' agreement to forward the invitation letters to all post-primary principals via C2K, and with the endorsement of the committee. Are members content with that? Want to put that on the record? Okay, thank you. Yeah. The only other, just in terms of the main bit, Robin had mentioned to me, he's had to leave, there's a specific issue as regards Strandtown Primary Schools. I suggested perhaps that is retabled next week, given the opportunity if he wants to raise it. I think it's a constituency issue. Just in terms of, well, I suppose just deal with them in terms of the tabled items, or sorry, the items that are part of the package. Anybody want to raise any other items under that? Sean?
Just say the autism one there. Did we forward that to the department? It was.
Which? Just refer to which item number?
This is from 8.5.
8.5. The autism. Sorry. Yeah. I thought you said Odyssey for a second. That's what sort of threw me for a second. But do you want to forward that then to the department? Or?
I think, Chair, the question that the all-party group are asking is what did the committee do about it? So the plan would be to write back to Mr Bradley and say we already wrote to the department and to the HSSPS and send all those letters to them so we can see what we did.
Yeah. Okay. Right. In terms of action, then, in terms of the couple of tabled items, note there's an invitation to the Computing at School conference. And that's at Stranmillis. Has that been named any members that want to attend? Or?
I believe it is, Chair.
Okay. Members note that. There's also an invitation to myself in terms of the Consulate General of the People's Republic of China. There's inauguration of the Consulate General at 5:30 on the 8th of June. I suppose that might depend a little bit in terms of timing of what his plenary is at in connection with that. So if we note that correspondence, there's a suggested sort of list of sort of agreement. A suggested list of way of dealing with the correspondence at 268 to 270. Are members content with that? Proceed. Okay. If we move then just to the final item, or I suppose the final item of substance, the forward work programme. There's an informal meeting. First of all, it's at page 300. Just refer to a couple of items here. There's been an informal meeting that's been scheduled with Women's Aid on Tuesday, the 16th of June at 1 p.m. The early years budgets. Just to inform members of that. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Just Chair, that the Women's Aid had, I think they approached a number of members. There was correspondence we considered last week. They had their funding, they were funded under the Early Years Fund. They're not funded anymore under that. So, given that members did hear a little bit about that from the department, the committee won't be able to provide any clarity. They know that, but I think they want to make their case.
Okay, fair enough. Then next week, I suppose the other thing we need to establish fairly here, we're due to hold our meeting next week in Derrygonnelly Field Studies Council Outdoor Education Centre, and members have also been agreed to attend the Fermanagh Trust celebration of shared education in Fermanagh, the Lough Erne resort at 12:45. Now, in New York. I think it's important. I appreciate that probably about half the committee isn't here, so we will need to drill down in relation to this. Could members give an indication of their availability in connection with that? Certainly I'll be going. Chris, Sean.
I had planned to go, but it's the Women in Politics conference.
Understand that. And
even Pat already said no.
Nelson gets nervous enough coming as far as East Belfast without.
I challenge you to come into the West.
Understandable.
There is a West beyond East Belfast, you know. This is beyond the West.
Okay. We'll have to establish the one thing. Just we'll need to establish. I appreciate. I think 3 yeses and 3 nos. We'll need to establish off the other members, because the one thing we do need to ensure is if we're going down to Fermanagh that we do have a quorum. There's no point in ending up with 3 or 4 of us going down and then suddenly finding, and so therefore we need fairly definitive answers.
The other members are no, are they?
Oh, sorry?
I'm just thinking, just looking around, the other members are a no, are they?
I think Trevor may go. So if it's the case, Chair, that it's less than 5, then I take it the committee agrees. We'll just make polite apologies and reschedule for here.
Okay. I think yes. I think I'll test that and leave that with the members need to sort of keep a sort of certain watching brief then, and don't be sitting just down from on your own if we do end up here. Okay, just a reminder as well that this afternoon from 2 to 4 there's a departmental reception in the Long Gallery for every school is a good school, but particularly for outstanding and very good schools and preschool providers.
Did we get any indications to how they selected the schools for that?
It's from the ETI inspections. So this is schools that have gone from maybe satisfactory or good to very good or outstanding, and celebrating that.
Okay. Then also just in terms of the forward work programme, shows the oral evidence taking session for the Senate bill, which will conclude before the summer recess. Are members agreed with the forward work programme? Okay. Right. Any other business anybody has? If not, then the next meeting will be at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, the 10th of June, in a location to be decided. Put it then to the committee that the committee does formally adjourn. Committee is adjourned.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks,